Carl Jung explained, 10 spiritual clues that show your soul is hiding pain behind strength. Jung discovered something that terrified him, something he almost didn't publish because it contradicted everything society taught about resilience, self-reliance, and inner fortitude. He found that the strongest people, the ones everyone leaned on, the ones who never broke down, the ones who held families and companies and communities together, were often the closest to complete psychological annihilation, not despite their strength, because of it. In his private notes from 1913, Jung wrote about a revelation that shook his understanding of the human psyche. The greatest danger to the soul is not weakness, but the strength that prevents weakness from being felt. He observed patient after patient presenting with what he called the compensatory persona, individuals who appeared supremely capable, emotionally regulated, psychologically sophisticated, and utterly composed. They came to analysis not because they were falling apart, but because something felt mysteriously wrong beneath their successful exteriors. And what Jung discovered horrified him. These people weren't strong at all. They were fragmenting. Their strength was a psychological fortress, an elaborate defense system built to contain wounds so terrifying, so unbearable, that consciousness could not acknowledge them without risking total collapse. Jung realized he was looking at dissociation masquerading as virtue. The culture celebrated these individuals as models of human excellence, the mother who never complained despite raising 5 children alone, the businessman who built an empire while his childhood trauma festered in his unconscious, the therapist who counseled hundreds while her own soul screamed in silence. Society gave them medals. Jung saw them as walking time bombs. Here's what made this discovery so dangerous. These people could not simply open up or be vulnerable the way therapy conventionally suggested. Their strength identity wasn't optional. It was the only thing preventing complete psychological disintegration. Jung described it as a dam holding back an ocean of unfelt pain, and the dam was cracking. But here's the part that made Jung's colleagues dismiss him as too mystical, too unscientific, too spiritually oriented. He discovered that the soul, that numinous, transcendent aspect of psyche, was actively trying to communicate the hidden pain through what he called spiritual symptoms, not just psychological ones, spiritual. The soul was using synchronicities, recurring dream symbols, mysterious bodily sensations, and behavioral patterns that bypassed conscious defenses entirely. It was speaking in a language most people couldn't decode, a language that didn't say, "I'm depressed" or "I have childhood wounds." Instead, it whispered through strange coincidences, books about surrender that kept appearing in your life, conversations about breakdown that followed you everywhere, dreams of drowning that woke you gasping. It screamed through your body, chronic illnesses that no doctor could explain, autoimmune conditions that attacked your own cells, mysterious pain that migrated and shifted and refused every treatment. It erupted through sudden, inexplicable rage, moments where you became someone unrecognizable, where years of suppressed fury exploded over something trivial. Jung realized that what psychiatry called symptoms were actually the soul's desperate attempts to force consciousness to acknowledge what strength had imprisoned. The spiritual clues were everywhere, but the strongest people never saw them, because seeing them required admitting something their entire identity was built to deny, that beneath the capability, the competence, the unshakable composure, they were dying inside. Jung wrote in his journal, "I have seen patients maintain perfect psychological facades for decades, only to collapse completely when one more feather is added to their burden. The soul can only speak in whispers for so long. Eventually, it must scream." This video reveals the 10 spiritual clues Jung identified The ways your soul signals that it's hiding unbearable pain behind unsustainable strength. Not psychological red flags, spiritual ones. Because Jung understood something modern psychology still struggles to grasp. The deepest wounds don't just live in your mind or your childhood memories. They live in your soul, and the soul has its own language, its own timeline, its own methods of forcing you to finally feel what you've spent your entire life avoiding. You might be watching this because you're exhausted by your own strength, because you've held everything together for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to fall apart. Because everyone calls you resilient, but you feel hollow. Because your body is breaking down in ways medicine can't explain. Because you have sudden moments of rage or despair that terrify you with their intensity. Because you keep encountering the same strange coincidences, the same recurring dreams, the same mysterious invitations to surrender that you've been refusing for years. Jung would tell you these aren't random, they're clues. Your soul is trying to save you from the strength that's killing you, but first, you need to understand how this happened, how the strongest version of yourself became the most dangerous prison your psyche ever built. Jung called it living from the inflated persona. But that clinical term doesn't capture the lived reality of what he observed in his most challenging patients. These were people who had become trapped in an identity of unbreakable strength, not because they chose it, but because their psyche had no other option for survival. It's not real strength, it's compensation. The psychological mechanism works like this. When a child experiences something their developing psyche cannot process, trauma, neglect, the loss of safety, being forced into premature responsibility, consciousness makes a devastating choice. It splits. The vulnerable, wounded parts of the self get locked away in what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything consciousness cannot acknowledge without threatening its stability. And in their place, consciousness constructs a compensatory identity, the strong one, the person who never needs help, never shows weakness, never collapses. For the traumatized child who had to parent their alcoholic mother, this became, I am the responsible one. For the neglected child whose emotions were ignored or punished, this became, I am the one who doesn't need anything. For the child who witnessed violence or chaos, this became, I am the one who stays calm no matter what. Jung observed that these compensatory personas could become so sophisticated, so complete, that even the person living through them had no conscious memory of making this choice. It felt like who they were, not a defense, an identity. Modern psychology has validated Jung's observations with devastating precision. Research on complex developmental trauma shows that children who experience emotional neglect, parentification, or unpredictable caregiving environments often develop what clinicians now call compulsive self-reliance. They literally lose the capacity to ask for help, to acknowledge vulnerability, to recognize their own needs as legitimate. One study tracking adults who experience childhood emotional neglect found that 73% demonstrated dismissive attachment patterns, meaning they had learned that depending on others was dangerous, and safety could only be found in absolute self-sufficiency. But here's what makes this so insidious. These people are often extraordinarily successful. They become the doctors, the lawyers, the entrepreneurs, the therapists, the community leaders. Their compensatory strength drives achievement, competence, and the ability to function under pressure that would break others. Society rewards them, promotes them, holds them up as models of human excellence. No one sees the cost. Jung saw it everywhere. The friend everyone confides in who never shares their own struggles, because their identity depends on being the helper, never the helped. The professional who never misses a day of work despite personal crisis, because stopping would mean feeling, and feeling would mean confronting the imprisoned pain. the parent who holds the entire family together through crisis after crisis, because they learned in childhood that they were only valuable when they were strong. The activist who fights tirelessly for others' suffering, because focusing on collective pain is safer than acknowledging their own. These patterns all share the same core structure: strength as defense, capability as dissociation, resilience as refusal to feel, and the soul? The soul is screaming. But it can't scream in ways the conscious mind will recognize, because the entire personality structure is built to not hear that scream. So it has to get creative. Jung documented the ways the soul finds alternative routes to consciousness, mysterious chronic illnesses that force rest, the body staging an intervention when the mind refuses to stop, sudden addiction that seems to come from nowhere, the psyche's desperate attempt to numb pain that can no longer be contained, rage attacks that are completely disproportionate to their triggers, years of suppressed anger erupting through the smallest crack in composure, existential despair that descends without apparent cause, the soul's exhaustion finally breaking through the defensive structure, sexual dysfunction or complete loss of desire, the body refusing to be vulnerable when emotional vulnerability is impossible, compulsive helping that leads to complete burnout, the wounded inner child trying to get the care they never received by giving it to everyone else. Jung realized these weren't separate symptoms. They were all variations of the same spiritual crisis, the soul trying to force consciousness to acknowledge what the strong one persona had imprisoned. But here's the deadly bind he discovered. These people cannot simply let their guard down or allow themselves to be vulnerable the way therapy conventionally recommends, because their strength isn't a choice they're making. It's the architecture holding their fragmented psyche together. Jung wrote about a patient who, when he suggested she might need to rest and allow herself to feel weak, looked at him with genuine terror and said, "Doctor, if I stop being strong for even one day, I'm afraid I'll never be able to start again. I'll just disappear." She wasn't being dramatic. She was describing the psychological reality of living with a dissociated self-structure. Her strength wasn't just a habit or a personality trait. It was the psychic glue preventing complete fragmentation. This is what modern culture fundamentally misunderstands about the strong people in our lives. We think they're so capable, they have it all together. Jung thought they're one trigger away from catastrophic breakdown, and they have no idea. The problem manifests differently for everyone, but the core pattern remains consistent. There is pain that cannot be felt without threatening the entire identity structure. So the soul is forced to communicate that pain through indirect channels, spiritual symptoms that bypass conscious defenses. And the person experiencing these symptoms dismisses them, ignores them, pushes through them, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging the vulnerability they've built their entire life to avoid. You might recognize yourself in this description. The person everyone relies on, but who never admits they're struggling. The one who holds everything together while fragmenting internally. The achiever whose success feels hollow. The helper whose care for others masks the neglected child within. The strong one who can't remember the last time they cried, asked for help, or admitted they couldn't handle something. If that's you, Jung would want you to understand something crucial. This isn't your fault. You didn't choose to become this. Your psyche made the best decision it could, with the resources it had when you were too young to have any other options. Your strength saved you. But what saved you in childhood is now imprisoning your soul in adulthood. And your soul has been trying to tell you this for years, through spiritual clues you've been trained to ignore. The question isn't whether you'll eventually confront this hidden pain. Jung discovered that suppressed pain always finds its way to consciousness, always. The question is whether you'll meet it consciously, with choice and support and gradual integration, or whether you'll ignore it until your psyche has no option but to force a catastrophic breakdown that shatters everything you've built. Her name was Frida. At least that's what Jung called her in his private case notes, the real name obscured to protect her identity. She came to Jung's practice in Zurich in 1912, referred by a colleague who found her case baffling. Nothing was wrong exactly, but nothing was quite right either. Frida was 34, a successful translator fluent in 5 languages, married to a respected academic. She presented as everything a therapist hopes for in a patient. Articulate, psychologically minded, emotionally composed, committed to self-understanding. In their first sessions, she could analyze her childhood with clinical precision: distant father, emotionally cold mother, early responsibility caring for younger siblings. She identified her patterns clearly: perfectionism, difficulty with intimacy, tendency toward overwork. She spoke about all of this with remarkable detachment, not defensive, just absent, like she was describing someone else's life. Jung felt something was profoundly wrong, but he couldn't identify what. Frida never missed an appointment, always completed any reflective exercises he suggested, had insights about herself that would have taken other patients months to reach. She was the perfect patient, and that's what disturbed him. After 3 months of analysis, Jung wrote in his notes, "She speaks of her pain, but I do not sense she feels it. It's as if she's giving me a report about suffering rather than experiencing it. Where is the emotion? Where is the vulnerability?" He began to push gently. In one session, she described a memory of being locked in a closet as punishment when she was 7. She recounted it matter-of-factly. "I remember being quite frightened. It was dark. I couldn't breathe properly. But I learned to calm myself down by reciting multiplication tables." Jung asked, "What do you feel now as you remember this?" "Well, I understand it was problematic parenting. My mother was overwhelmed. She didn't have the emotional resources to—" "No," Jung interrupted. "I'm not asking what you understand. What do you feel?" Long silence. Frida looked confused, as if he'd asked her to perform an impossible task. I'm not sure I understand the question." Jung realized he was looking at complete dissociation from feeling function. She could think about her pain with extraordinary sophistication. She could analyze her wounds with clinical accuracy, but she could not feel them. Her strength, that remarkable composure, that intellectual clarity, that emotional regulation everyone admired, was actually a sophisticated, dissociative structure. Over the next several sessions, Jung tried different approaches to help Frida access her emotions, focusing on body sensations, working with dreams, inviting her to speak as her child self rather than about her child self. Nothing worked. Frida remained impeccably composed, insightful, and completely disconnected from her actual emotional reality. Jung noted strange symptoms she mentioned casually: recurring nightmares of drowning that woke her, gasping for air several times a week, mysterious fainting spells that had started in her 20s. She would suddenly lose consciousness, always catching herself before hitting the ground. No medical cause ever found. Compulsive overwork where she couldn't rest even when exhausted. She'd translated 3 entire books in the past 6 months, while maintaining a full household. Occasional moments of rage at her husband over trivial things. Rage so intense it frightened her, followed immediately by profound shame and increased composure. To Frida, these were annoying symptoms to be managed. To Jung, they were her soul screaming in the only language it could access: the drowning dreams, symbolic of being overwhelmed by unconscious material she refused to feel consciously. The fainting, dissociative episodes where her psyche literally removed her from situations that threatened to trigger feeling. The overwork, staying constantly busy to avoid the void where emotions lived. The rage, years of suppressed anger erupting through momentary cracks in her defensive structure. But Jung couldn't get her to see this connection, because seeing it would require acknowledging that her strength wasn't strength at all. It was defense, and her entire identity depended on being strong. Then, in their 9th month of analysis, something broke. Frida came to her session appearing composed as usual, but Jung sensed something different in her energy, tighter, more controlled, like she was holding something back with tremendous effort. Halfway through the session, Jung asked about a dream she'd mentioned, another drowning dream, but this time there were hands pushing her under the water. Whose hands? Jung asked. I don't know. Look closer. Whose hands are holding you under? I can't. Whose hands, Frida? And she shattered. Complete dissociative collapse, sobbing so violent her entire body convulsed, gasping for air between waves of grief, curling into herself on Jung's consulting room floor, and between the sobs, fragments of memory. My uncle, I was 6. He said it was our game. I tried to tell my mother, but she said I was lying. She called me wicked. She locked me in the closet for making up stories. I stopped. I stopped feeling anything. I had to. I had to be good. I had to be strong. I had to forget. 40 years of suppressed childhood sexual abuse erupted in that session. Jung stayed with her, not interpreting, not analyzing, just witnessing. When she could finally speak again, she looked at him with devastation. I thought I was fine. I thought I'd dealt with everything. How could I not have known? Jung's response captured everything he'd learned about the hidden pain behind strength. You did know. Your soul knew. That's why you couldn't breathe in your dreams. You were drowning in unfelt feeling. That's why your body made you faint. It was trying to protect you from situations that might trigger the memory. That's why you worked constantly. Staying busy was the only way to avoid the silence where the truth lived. You were never fine. You were surviving, and your strength, that remarkable strength everyone admired, was the fortress keeping you safe from memories your conscious mind couldn't process. The months that followed were excruciating. Once the defensive structure cracked, decades of pain flooded through. Frida experienced profound depression, rage, shame, grief, all the emotions her strong persona had successfully suppressed for 40 years. She couldn't work. She couldn't maintain her composure. She couldn't be the person everyone had always known. Her husband was bewildered. Her colleagues were concerned. Everyone wanted the old Frida back, the composed, capable, strong one. But Jung understood. The old Frida had to die for the real Frida to be born. This wasn't breakdown, it was breakthrough. The pain wasn't new. It had been there all along, festering in her unconscious, poisoning her soul, speaking through symptoms she'd been trained to ignore. Now it was finally being felt, and only through feeling it could she integrate it. Jung worked with Frida for another 3 years. Slowly, painfully, she learned to inhabit her vulnerability without being destroyed by it, to acknowledge her wounds without letting them define her, to develop genuine strength, not defensive strength that excluded weakness, but integrated strength that could include both capability and vulnerability. She never returned to translation work. Instead, she began working with young women who had experienced abuse, helping them find their voices when she had finally found her own. Jung wrote about her case decades later. Frida taught me that the soul will always speak the truth, even when consciousness refuses to listen. Her drowning dreams, her fainting spells, her inexplicable rage, these were not symptoms to be eliminated. They were messages to be decoded. Her soul was trying desperately to force her to feel what her strength would not allow. I learned from her that our task as therapists is not to strengthen the defenses, but to help people consciously dismantle them before their psyche is forced to do it catastrophically. This case became foundational for Jung's understanding of dissociation, trauma, and the shadow. He realized that many, perhaps most, of the people who appeared strongest were actually living from dissociated personas designed to protect them from unbearable pain. And the soul, unable to speak through conscious channels, was forced to communicate through spiritual symptoms, symbolic dreams, synchronistic events, mysterious bodily experiences, and behavioral patterns that bypassed rational defenses. The implications were staggering. You could be in therapy for years, gaining insight after insight, and never actually feel the pain you were analyzing. You could appear perfectly functional, even exemplary, while your soul was fragmenting. You could be dying inside while everyone around you saw only strength. Frida's story reveals the terrifying truth about hidden pain. It doesn't feel hidden to you. It feels like you've dealt with it, moved past it, transcended it through strength and competence and sheer willpower. But your soul knows better, and it will keep sending clues, dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, body sensations, until you finally allow yourself to feel what you've spent your whole life avoiding. The question is, will you recognize those clues before your psyche is forced to shatter your defenses completely? Jung's observations about Frida and countless patients like her were dismissed by many of his contemporaries as too mystical, too focused on symbolism and soul rather than measurable psychological facts. But modern research has validated his insights with devastating precision. We now have scientific language for what Jung observed intuitively. People who appear strongest are often surviving through sophisticated dissociative structures that mask profound trauma. The research is staggering. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress followed 847 adults who had experienced adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. The researchers identified a subgroup they termed high-functioning trauma survivors, people who, by all external measures, were successful. Stable careers, relationships, no obvious psychiatric diagnosis. But when researchers dug deeper, they found something alarming. These individuals showed the same neurobiological markers of trauma as people with diagnosed PTSD, hyperactive amygdala, dysregulated HPA axis, compromised prefrontal cortex function. The difference? They had developed compensatory strategies so effective that their trauma remained completely hidden from others and often from themselves. One researcher noted these individuals had essentially trained their nervous systems to override distress signals. They could function through states of internal alarm that would incapacitate most people. But the cost was profound. Their bodies were in constant stress mode, even when they reported feeling fine. This is exactly what Jung observed in Frida and others. Strength as dissociation, capability as disconnection from internal state. Research on attachment patterns has provided another layer of validation. Studies following children from infancy through adulthood show that those with dismissive avoidant attachment, usually resulting from emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving, develop a remarkable capacity for self-reliance. They learn not to rely on others, not to show need, not to expect comfort. And by all external measures, they appear extraordinarily strong and independent. But neuroimaging studies reveal the cost. These individuals show decreased activation in brain regions associated with social bonding and increased activation in regions associated with self-regulation and emotional suppression. They've literally rewired their brains to function in isolation. Dr. Alan Shore, a leading researcher in attachment neuroscience, describes this as affect regulation through dissociation. The person learns to disconnect from their emotional experience as an adaptive strategy when emotions brought danger in childhood. It works brilliantly until it doesn't, because suppressed emotions don't disappear. This brings us to perhaps the most significant validation of Jung's observations, the research on psychosomatic illness and trauma. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's landmark work, documented in The Body Keeps the Score, demonstrates that unfelt emotional pain doesn't just stay in the psyche, it lodges in the body. His research shows that people with unprocessed trauma have significantly higher rates of autoimmune disorders, conditions where the body literally attacks itself. Chronic pain syndromes, fibromyalgia, migraines, unexplained musculoskeletal pain, gastrointestinal disorders, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, chronic digestive issues, cardiovascular problems, hypertension, heart disease, irregular rhythms. The correlation is so strong that van der Kolk writes, "The body manifests what the mind refuses to acknowledge." When people cannot feel their pain consciously, their bodies are forced to express it physically. This is exactly what Jung observed when patients presented with mysterious physical symptoms that had no clear medical cause. Frida's fainting spells, other patients' chronic illnesses, unexplained pain that migrated throughout the body. Jung understood these weren't psychosomatic in the dismissive sense. They were the soul speaking through the only language left available when consciousness refused to listen. Recent research has even identified specific mechanisms for how this happens. Studies on inflammation show that chronic emotional suppression leads to persistent elevation of pro-inflammatory cytokines. The body's immune system becomes hyperactive, as if constantly fighting an infection that isn't there. Except the infection is there. It's the unfelt pain festering in the unconscious. One fascinating study looked at people who scored high on emotional suppression scales, individuals who consistently avoided feeling or expressing difficult emotions. Researchers found these people had 40% higher rates of autoimmune conditions, significantly elevated cortisol levels even at rest, decreased heart rate variability, a measure of stress resilience, compromised immune function measured by natural killer cell activity. Their bodies were breaking down from the effort of holding pain at bay. But perhaps the most profound validation of Jung's observations comes from research on what scientists call learned helplessness override. Classic studies on learned helplessness showed that when animals experienced inescapable stress, they eventually stopped trying to escape. They became passive, depressed, helpless. But researchers discovered something surprising. Some individuals, both animal and human, develop the opposite pattern. Instead of helplessness, they develop compulsive agency, hyperactive attempts to control, fix, and overcome. They become the opposite of helpless. They become aggressively self-reliant. And neuroscience reveals why. The prefrontal cortex essentially overrides the amygdala's distress signals, creating a state of functional dissociation where the person can act despite internal alarm. It's brilliantly adaptive in the short term. In the long term, it leads to what researchers call physiological burden, the cumulative wear on the body from chronic stress that isn't consciously felt. These individuals often have no idea they're stressed. They report feeling fine, but their bodies tell a different story. Elevated inflammatory markers, disrupted sleep architecture, compromised immune function, accelerated cellular aging. One researcher described it as their conscious mind says, "I'm fine," but their biology is screaming. This is the hidden cost of strength that Jung recognized. It requires constant dissociation from internal state, and that dissociation has measurable biological consequences. Research on spiritual emergence and crisis provides another fascinating layer. Studies by Dr. Stanislav Grof and others have documented that people undergoing psychological transformation, often triggered by unprocessed trauma surfacing, frequently report increased synchronicities and meaningful coincidences, vivid symbolic dreams with recurring themes, spontaneous spiritual experiences, heightened sensitivity to energy and emotion. These aren't woo-woo phenomena. They're measurable shifts in how people process and perceive reality when the psyche is trying to integrate previously dissociated material. Jung would call this the soul attempting to force consciousness through spiritual channels when psychological ones remain blocked. Modern neuroscience offers a mechanism. When trauma begins surfacing from the unconscious, the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential processing, becomes hyperactive. This leads to increased pattern recognition, enhanced symbolic thinking, and what people experience as meaningful coincidences. The psyche is essentially turning up the volume on anything that might help consciousness recognize and integrate the hidden pain. Finally, research on what's called vulnerable narcissism or covert narcissism reveals another manifestation of pain hidden behind strength. Unlike grandiose narcissists, who are obviously inflated, vulnerable narcissists present as competent, self-sufficient, and strong, but underneath harbor profound feelings of inadequacy, shame, and fragility. They've developed what psychologists call a false self, a protective identity built to hide the wounded true self. This is precisely Jung's inflated persona, a compensatory structure that appears strong but is actually defending against unbearable vulnerability. Studies show these individuals have some of the highest rates of chronic depression masked by activity and achievement, sudden catastrophic breakdowns later in life, physical illness concentrated in middle age when defenses begin failing. The research across disciplines points to the same conclusion Jung reached. Strength can be defense, capability can be dissociation, resilience can be refusal to feel, and when pain is hidden behind strength, it doesn't disappear. It surfaces through the body, through spiritual symptoms, through mysterious behavioral patterns that bypass conscious awareness. The person experiencing this often has no idea. They feel fine, they function well. They appear to everyone, including themselves, as strong and capable. But their nervous system knows, their body knows, their soul knows, and eventually, one way or another, consciousness will be forced to know too. The only question is whether that knowing happens through conscious choice and gradual integration, or through catastrophic breakdown when the defensive structure can no longer hold. Jung understood this. Science now validates it. The strongest people are often the most fragile, and the signs of their hidden pain are everywhere, if you know how to read them. Your soul is trying to tell you something. It's been trying for years, maybe decades, but it can't speak in the language of rational thought because your conscious mind has powerful defenses against acknowledging the pain you're hiding behind strength. So it speaks in symbols, in coincidences, in dreams, in your body, in patterns that bypass your intellectual understanding and speak directly to the unconscious. Jung discovered that when people are living from a defensive persona, when strength is masking unbearable pain, the psyche generates specific, identifiable, spiritual symptoms, not psychological symptoms you'd recognize as problems, spiritual clues that feel mysterious, inexplicable, or strangely meaningful. These are the 10 archetypal patterns Jung observed most frequently in people whose souls were hiding pain behind strength. Clue number 1. Synchronicities of breakdown. You keep encountering the same theme everywhere you turn. Books about surrender appear on your path, mentioned by friends, recommended by algorithms, sitting on cafe tables you happen to sit near. Conversations seem to follow you, people discussing nervous breakdowns, the importance of falling apart, the necessity of vulnerability. Media reflects it back. Every movie, every article, every podcast episode somehow touches on themes of collapse and letting go. Jung called these synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that transcend mere probability. But they're not random. They're your psyche using the external world to mirror what your internal world refuses to acknowledge. The mechanism is profound. When unconscious material is trying to surface, the psyche becomes hyper-attuned to anything in the environment that relates to that material. It's not that the universe is sending you messages, it's that your soul is desperate for consciousness, to recognize the pattern it keeps avoiding. Self-identification questions. Have books, articles, or conversations about surrender, breakdown, or vulnerability been appearing with unusual frequency? Do you notice these themes but quickly dismiss them as not relevant to you because you're handling everything fine? Does part of you feel strangely drawn to stories of people who fell apart and rebuilt, while another part insists you'd never need that? What your soul is trying to say, you need to let go. The strength you're clinging to is preventing your transformation. I'm surrounding you with mirrors so you'll finally see what you're avoiding. Clue number 2, dreams of drowning or being chased. The same nightmares recur with disturbing frequency. You're underwater, struggling to breathe, being pulled down by invisible forces, or you're running from something you can't see, terror mounting, your legs heavy and slow, or you're trying to scream but no sound comes out. You wake gasping, heart pounding, the emotional residue lingering through your morning, but you dismiss them as just stress dreams and push through your day. Jung understood that dreams of drowning, being chased, or being unable to speak are the soul's symbolic language for one reality. You are being overwhelmed by unconscious material. You refuse to feel consciously. The water represents emotions. You're drowning in unfelt feeling. The pursuer represents shadow content. The parts of yourself you've exiled are trying to catch you, integrate with you. The silenced scream represents your inability to express the pain you're carrying. You literally cannot give it voice. The psychological mechanism. During sleep, conscious defenses weaken. The material you suppress all day, pain, vulnerability, need, surges toward consciousness. But even in sleep, your defensive structure is active, so the content can't surface directly. Instead, it appears symbolically, disguised as archetypal imagery. Your conscious mind won't immediately recognize as personal. Self-identification questions. Do you have recurring dreams of drowning, being chased, or being unable to speak? Have these dreams intensified as your strength has been more challenged in waking life? Do you wake from these dreams feeling not just scared, but somehow known? Like the dream is seeing something about you that you hide from everyone. What your soul is trying to say. The pain you're suppressing is becoming too powerful to contain. I'm showing you symbolically what's happening internally. You're drowning in unfelt emotion, being pursued by disowned parts of yourself, silenced by your own defenses. Please feel this before you're forced to. Clue number 3. The helper's exhaustion. You're always there for everyone. The friend people call in crisis. The colleague who covers shifts, takes on extra work, makes sure everyone else is okay. The family member who holds everything together during difficult times. You pride yourself on this. It feels like your purpose, your value, your identity. But lately, something's wrong. The helping feels hollow. You're exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You feel resentful of the very people you're helping, then immediately guilty for that resentment. You can't remember the last time someone asked how you are, really asked and waited for a real answer. Because you've trained everyone that you don't need that. You're the strong one. Jung would see this pattern immediately. Compulsive caretaking is often the wounded inner child trying desperately to get the care they never received by giving it to everyone else. The mechanism. When a child's needs are consistently unmet, one adaptation is to become the person who meets others' needs. This serves two functions. It creates a sense of control. I'm not helpless and needy like I was as a child. I'm powerful and needed. And it's an unconscious attempt to receive vicariously. If you give others what you needed, perhaps you'll finally feel the nourishment you're starving for. But it never works, because you can't fill your own emptiness by filling others. And the exhaustion you feel isn't just tiredness. It's your soul's protest against the betrayal of continuing to abandon yourself while caring for everyone else. Self-identification questions. Do you find yourself compulsively helping others even when you're depleted? Does the thought of someone else being the helper instead of you create anxiety or a sense of lost identity? Do you feel resentful when helping, then immediately guilty for feeling resentful? Can you remember the last time you asked for help and actually let someone give it to you without minimizing your need or quickly being fine again? What your soul is trying to say. The child within you is still waiting for someone to care for them. You keep trying to heal that wound by caring for others, but you're just perpetuating the original abandonment. I'm exhausting you so you'll finally stop and turn toward your own unmet needs. Clue number 4. Rage attacks from nowhere. It happens without warning. Someone makes a small comment, a minor inconvenience occurs, and suddenly you're consumed by rage so intense it frightens you. You snap at your partner over dishes. You have to pull your car over because anger is making you shake. You fantasize about screaming at people who have barely inconvenienced you. Then it passes and you're mortified. That's not who you are. You're the calm one, the rational one, the one who keeps it together. You apologize, dismiss it as stress, promise yourself it won't happen again. But it does. Jung called this enantiodromia, the sudden emergence of the opposite. When one psychic quality is held too rigidly, its opposite will eventually erupt with equal force. Extreme control becomes sudden loss of control. Rigid strength becomes explosive weakness. Constant composure becomes inexplicable rage. The mechanism. Every time you suppress anger in order to maintain your strong, composed persona, that anger doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the shadow, compressed, concentrated, building pressure. Eventually, the defensive structure develops a crack, usually during a moment of lowered defenses or accumulated stress, and years of suppressed rage erupts through that tiny opening. The trigger is never proportional to the response because the rage isn't actually about the trigger. It's about every boundary you didn't set, every time you said, "It's fine," when it wasn't, every violation you absorbed because you were too strong to be hurt by that. Self-identification questions. Do you have sudden, intense anger reactions that seem disproportionate to their triggers? Do these outbursts feel completely unlike your normal self, as if something else is taking over? After the rage passes, do you feel ashamed and confused about where it came from? Have you been praised throughout your life for never getting angry or always staying calm? What your soul is trying to say. You have been violating yourself for years, accepting unacceptable treatment, suppressing legitimate anger, prioritizing others' comfort over your own boundaries. I'm erupting because you won't listen to me any other way. This rage isn't the problem. Your refusal to feel and express anger appropriately is the problem. Clue number 5. Mysterious physical symptoms. Your body is breaking down in ways that don't make medical sense. Chronic pain that migrates. Your back 1 month, your neck the next, your joints after that. Digestive issues that no diet seems to fix. IBS, reflux, mysterious nausea. Autoimmune flares that come and go without clear triggers. fatigue so profound that no amount of rest resolves it. Mysterious numbness, tingling, or sensations that doctors can't explain. You've seen specialists, had tests. Everything comes back normal or idiopathic, which is medical language for we don't know why. So you're told it's stress, anxiety, or all in your head, which makes you feel crazy because the pain is very real. Jung understood something modern medicine still struggles with. The body is not separate from the psyche. When consciousness refuses to acknowledge emotional pain, the unconscious is forced to manifest it physically. The mechanism. Unfelt emotions create chronic nervous system dysregulation. Your body exists in a state of constant alert that you don't consciously feel because you've dissociated from internal sensations. This dysregulation manifests as chronic inflammation, your immune system attacking your own tissues because it can't find the enemy, which is actually the unfelt pain. Muscular tension, your body literally bracing against emotions you won't allow yourself to feel. Digestive dysfunction, the enteric nervous system shutting down because rest and digestion require feeling safe, and you're never truly safe when hiding pain. Fatigue, the exhaustion of constant dissociation and emotional suppression. Research shows that people with unprocessed trauma have significantly altered interoception, the ability to sense internal bodily states. You've become so disconnected from your body's signals that you don't realize you're in a chronic state of internal alarm. So your body has to scream louder, through pain, through illness, through symptoms that finally force you to stop and pay attention. Self-identification questions. Do you have chronic physical symptoms that medical professionals can't fully explain or treat? Do your symptoms seem to worsen during periods of high external stress, even though you don't feel more stressed emotionally? Have doctors suggested your symptoms are related to stress or anxiety, which frustrates you because you handle stress well? Does your body seem to break down as a way of forcing you to rest when you won't rest voluntarily? What your soul is trying to say. You've abandoned your body by disconnecting from it in order to maintain your strength. I'm manifesting pain physically because you won't acknowledge it emotionally. This illness isn't random. It's the only language I have left to force you to feel what you're refusing to feel. Clue number 6. Spiritual bypassing tendencies. You're deeply invested in your spiritual practice, meditation, mindfulness, positive thinking, high vibration living. You read spiritual teachers who emphasize transcendence, letting go of ego, rising above negativity, and it feels important, meaningful, like you're evolving. But there's something you don't examine too closely. You use your spiritual practice to avoid feeling difficult emotions. When pain surfaces, you immediately observe it without attachment. When anger arises, you breathe it away before actually feeling it. When someone hurts you, you immediately forgive and release without acknowledging the hurt. You're so focused on being conscious that you've become unconscious of your actual emotional reality. Jung warned about this extensively. He called it inflation through identification with the self, using spiritual concepts and practices to bypass the necessary work of integrating the shadow and feeling difficult emotions. The mechanism. True spirituality includes descent, confronting darkness, feeling pain, integrating shadow. But when spirituality becomes a defense against vulnerability, it perpetuates dissociation under the guise of enlightenment. You're using meditation to dissociate from feeling, using forgiveness to avoid acknowledging hurt, using high vibration thinking to suppress low vibration emotions like anger, grief, and need. It looks like spiritual advancement. It's actually spiritual defense, and your soul knows the difference. Self-identification questions. Do you use spiritual practices immediately when difficult emotions arise before actually feeling them? Do you pride yourself on not holding grudges or staying positive, even when you've been genuinely hurt or violated? Have you been told by others that you seem spiritually bypassing, which confused or offended you? Do you feel judgmental toward people who are stuck in negative emotions or not conscious enough? What your soul is trying to say, your spiritual practice has become another layer of defense, not a path to integration. Real transcendence requires first descending into the emotional reality you're avoiding. You're using light to avoid darkness, but wholeness requires both. Stop ascending and start feeling. Clue number 7, the collapse fantasy. You have a secret, a fantasy you'd never admit to anyone. Sometimes when you're overwhelmed but can't stop, you imagine getting sick, seriously sick, sick enough that you'd have to go to the hospital or take medical leave or have everyone understand that you simply cannot function right now. In the fantasy, there's relief. Finally, an acceptable reason to stop being strong, permission to rest without being weak. The fantasy might be illness or injury or even something more extreme, getting in an accident that's not your fault, something that would force everyone to finally see that you need care too. Then you feel horrified by these thoughts. What kind of person fantasizes about catastrophe? But Jung would understand immediately. This is your soul's desperate plea for rest, safety, and care, needs so unacceptable to your conscious identity that the only way your psyche can imagine them being met is through external catastrophe. The mechanism. Your wounded inner child never received permission to have needs, to rest, to be cared for, so your adult self cannot give yourself that permission. The only acceptable vulnerability in your internal economy is involuntary. Vulnerability, illness, injury, catastrophe beyond your control. This fantasy is actually a profound spiritual clue. You would rather have something terrible happen to you than consciously choose to be vulnerable and ask for what you need. Self-identification questions. Do you sometimes secretly fantasize about getting sick or injured as a way to finally rest? Does part of you feel envious when others have legitimate reasons to stop functioning and be cared for? Do you find yourself hoping for external catastrophes, never wanting to cause them, but hoping they'll happen, that would give you permission to finally not be strong? Have you noticed that the only time you allow yourself to be vulnerable or needy is when you're physically ill? What your soul is trying to say. You need rest, you need care, you need to stop, but your identity won't allow you to choose these things consciously. So I'm showing you through this fantasy how desperate the situation has become. You'd rather be forced into breakdown than consciously choose to be vulnerable. Please choose before I'm forced to make it happen. Clue number 8. Inability to cry. You can't remember the last time you cried. Not really cried. Maybe your eyes welled up at a movie or a single tear fell at a funeral, but full cathartic crying, where your body shakes and sobs and releases, hasn't happened in years, maybe decades. People sometimes comment on it. I've never seen you cry. You might even feel proud of it. Crying feels weak, out of control, something other people do. But sometimes, in private moments, you notice something disturbing. You encounter something that should make you cry. A profound loss, a heartbreak, a moment of overwhelming beauty or sadness, and you feel nothing. Or you feel something intellectually. You know you should be sad, but the tears won't come. Your body is frozen. Jung identified inability to cry as a classic sign of dissociation from the feeling function, the mechanism. Crying is the body's natural mechanism for processing and releasing emotional pain. When you learned that crying was dangerous because it made caregivers angry or uncomfortable, or because you had to stay strong for others, your psyche developed a mechanism to prevent crying. It's not that you're not sad, It's that the connection between emotional pain and its physical expression has been severed as a protective measure. Your tears are locked away with all the other vulnerable parts of yourself, and your inability to access them is your soul's prison made visible. Self-identification questions. Can you remember the last time you had a full cathartic cry? Do you feel proud or uncomfortable about your inability to cry? When encountering situations that would make most people cry, do you feel emotionally numb or distant? Have you ever felt the sensation of tears wanting to come, but being physically unable to let them out? What your soul is trying to say. Your grief is imprisoned. Your pain has nowhere to go. I've created this physical inability to cry to show you how deeply you've disconnected from your own emotional reality. You need to thaw. You need to feel. You need to finally release what you've been holding for so long that you've forgotten it's even there. Clue number 9. Compulsive productivity. You cannot rest without anxiety. Sitting still feels wrong. Weekends without plans feel empty and threatening. Vacation makes you uncomfortable. By day 3, you're looking for work to do. Your mind constantly generates lists, tasks to complete, problems to solve, ways to improve, goals to achieve. People call you motivated, driven, accomplished. But you know the truth beneath the accomplishment. You're running. Staying busy isn't about achievement, it's about avoidance. Because when you stop, when you're truly still, something unbearable threatens to surface. So you've engineered a life where you never have to stop. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. Compulsive activity as defense against the void where unfelt emotions live. The mechanism, productivity, creates a constant stream of external focus that prevents internal awareness. As long as you're busy achieving, helping, improving, there's no space for feeling. But it's more than just distraction. Productivity also provides constant evidence of your strength, your capability, your value. Every completed task, every goal achieved, every problem solved reinforces the identity that's protecting you from your wounds. I'm strong, I'm capable, I'm valuable. The terror underneath. If I stop being productive, I'll have to feel. And if I feel, I'll discover I'm not actually strong at all. Self-identification questions. Do you feel anxious, guilty, or uncomfortable when you're not being productive? Do you schedule every free moment so there's never empty time? When you do have free time, do you immediately fill it with tasks, projects, or productive activities rather than genuine rest? Do you feel your value is directly tied to your accomplishments and productivity? What your soul is trying to say. You're using constant motion to avoid the stillness where I can speak to you. Your productivity is a prison disguised as purpose. The void you're running from isn't empty. It's full of everything you've refused to feel. Please stop moving long enough to meet me. Clue number 10. The I'm fine automaticity. Someone asks how you are. I'm fine. The words come out automatically before you've even checked in with yourself. Your partner asks if you're upset. No, I'm fine, even though you're not. A friend notices you seem tired, stressed, overwhelmed. Really, I'm fine. It's become a reflex so automatic you don't even notice you're doing it. But here's what's terrifying. You're not just lying to others. You're lying to yourself. You've said I'm fine so many times that you've lost contact with your actual internal state. You genuinely don't know if you're fine or not. The strength persona has become so complete, so automatic that it's displaced your actual emotional reality. Jung would call this complete identification with the persona. You've become the mask. The mechanism. Every time you say, I'm fine when you're not, you reinforce the dissociation between your conscious identity and your actual emotional experience. You're training yourself not to feel. Over time, this creates what psychologists call alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing emotions. not because the emotions aren't there, but because you've lost access to the internal sensations that would tell you what you're actually feeling. Your "I'm fine" isn't a choice anymore. It's a compulsion, an automatic defense that activates before consciousness can assess the situation. Self-identification questions. Do you automatically say, "I'm fine," even when you're not, without consciously choosing to lie? When someone asks how you are, do you ever pause to actually check in with yourself before answering? Have people told you they can tell something's wrong even when you insist you're fine? Do you find it difficult to identify what you're actually feeling beyond fine, stressed, or tired? What your soul is trying to say? You've disappeared behind your defense. You're so identified with being fine that you've lost contact with your actual self. I'm trying to reach you, but you're not home anymore. You're living entirely in the persona. Please stop answering automatically and start actually asking yourself, how am I? What do I feel? What do I need? These 10 clues are not random. They're archetypal patterns that appear when the soul is desperately trying to communicate pain that consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Jung understood that the psyche is a self-regulating system. When conscious attitudes become too one-sided, when strength excludes all vulnerability, when control prevents all surrender, the unconscious will generate compensatory material, first through whispers, subtle dreams, minor synchronicities, small physical symptoms. If those are ignored, through louder signals, recurring nightmares, obvious patterns, more severe symptoms. And if those are still ignored, the psyche has no choice but to force consciousness through catastrophic breakdown. These 10 clues are your soul's progressive attempts to prevent that catastrophe. The question Jung would ask you, how many of these clues have you already been ignoring? Which of these patterns do you recognize in yourself but immediately dismiss as not that serious? Because here's what Jung discovered in case after case: people always knew. On some level, they always knew their strength was hiding unbearable pain. The clues were everywhere, but acknowledging them required something terrifying. Admitting that they weren't actually fine, that their strength was a defense, not authentic integration, that beneath the capability and composure, they were suffering in ways they'd never allowed themselves to consciously feel. Your soul knows you're reading this right now for a reason. It knows which of these 10 clues resonated with uncomfortable recognition. The question is, will you finally listen? Or will you do what you've always done? Acknowledge the pattern intellectually, then return to your defensive strength and wait for the next clue, the next warning, the next invitation to finally feel what you've been hiding. Jung would tell you, the clues won't stop. They'll only escalate until you choose consciousness, or consciousness chooses you through the breakdown you've been avoiding. Jung observed a terrifying progression. When the spiritual clues are ignored, when people continue living from defensive strength while their soul screams through symptoms, the consequences escalate in predictable stages. Not everyone experiences all 5 stages. Some people recognize the crisis earlier and choose conscious vulnerability before reaching the final stages. But for those who maintain their strength facade, despite their soul's warnings, Jung documented a descent that ends in what he called psychic death, being alive physically while dead spiritually. These are the 5 stages of soul death when hidden pain remains hidden. Danger. Under 1, spiritual disconnection timeline, already present, intensifies over 1 to 3 years. The first danger is subtle. So subtle you might not recognize it as danger at all. Life becomes flat. You're still functioning, still achieving, still appearing successful, but something essential has gone missing. Meaning, the numinous quality that once made life feel purposeful, sacred, or deeply significant has evaporated. Jung called this loss of the symbolic function, when life becomes purely literal, mechanical, stripped of the dimension that connects human experience to something transcendent. You go through the motions expertly, but there's no soul in it. Work that once felt meaningful now feels like tasks to complete. Relationships that once felt vital now feel like obligations to manage. Spiritual or creative practices that once fed you now feel empty, performative. Even beauty stops moving you. You see a sunset and think, that's pretty, instead of feeling awe. You hear music and appreciate it technically but feel nothing. Someone shares something vulnerable and you respond appropriately but feel disconnected from genuine empathy. The mechanism, your soul, is what connects you to meaning, depth, and the numinous. When you imprison your soul behind defensive strength, you lose access to everything the soul provides. You remain conscious and functional, but you're operating from ego alone, and ego without soul is mechanical existence. Warning signs, describing life as fine but lacking the enthusiasm you once had. Feeling like you're going through the motions without real engagement. Loss of interest in activities that used to feel meaningful or sacred. Increasing cynicism or emotional flatness. Sense that life is happening to you rather than being actively lived. Real-world example. Mark was a surgeon who had loved medicine passionately for 20 years. By his late 40s, he still performed excellently but felt nothing. Operations that once felt like sacred work, holding life in his hands, now felt like complex mechanics. He couldn't explain what changed, but Jung would recognize it immediately. Mark had suppressed so much grief from losing patients, from medical school trauma, from childhood wounds, that his soul had withdrawn. Without soul, even saving lives felt empty. The spiritual cost. This stage is dangerous precisely because it doesn't feel dangerous. You're still functional. People still see you as successful. So you don't seek help. But you're living what Jung called the provisional life, postponing authentic existence, going through appropriate motions, never actually inhabiting your own experience. It's soul death in slow motion. And because you're still strong, nobody, including you, recognizes the crisis. Danger Tier 2, the body's rebellion timeline. 5 years into spiritual disconnection. The second stage is when your body refuses to cooperate with your dissociation anymore. The mysterious symptoms from clue number 5 intensify dramatically. What was manageable chronic pain becomes debilitating. What was occasional digestive distress becomes constant illness. What was periodic fatigue becomes profound exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch. Autoimmune conditions emerge or flare with increasing severity. You develop conditions doctors struggle to explain: fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, mysterious neurological symptoms, persistent pain that travels throughout your body. You're forced into the medical system. Specialists, tests, treatments that provide temporary relief but never address the root cause, because the root cause isn't physical. The mechanism, your body is staging an intervention. Jung understood that psyche and soma are one system. When the psyche is prevented from expressing pain consciously, the body must express it physically. But more than that, your body is trying to force you to stop, to rest, to finally acknowledge that you cannot continue at this pace, with this level of dissociation, without consequences. Every illness is your body saying, I need you to feel what you're refusing to feel. Warning signs, multiple unexplained medical conditions appearing or worsening. Doctors using terms like chronic, syndrome, idiopathic, or stress-related. Treatments working temporarily but symptoms always returning. Physical collapse occurring during or immediately after periods of high stress or achievement. Feeling betrayed by your body, angry at its weakness. Real-world example. Jessica was a non-profit director who'd spent 15 years serving others while ignoring her own needs. At 42, her body rebelled. Severe autoimmune flares that left her bedridden, mysterious neuropathy in her hands and feet, migraines that lasted days. Doctors found inflammation but no clear cause. Jessica felt angry. She was doing important work. Why was her body failing her? Jung would see it differently. Her body wasn't failing, it was succeeding, forcing her to finally stop and feel the pain she'd been carrying since childhood. The spiritual cost. This stage can last years, people spending their energy fighting their body's symptoms rather than hearing their body's message. The danger: you can treat symptoms medically while never addressing the psycho-spiritual cause. You can manage the illness while continuing to live from defensive strength. But you can't heal, because healing would require feeling, and feeling is still too threatening to your identity. Danger. 3. Relational desertification timeline, concurrent with stage 2, intensifying over 2 to 4 years. The third danger emerges in your relationships. Slowly, without you fully noticing, genuine intimacy becomes impossible. Not because you don't have relationships. You might have many: friends, family, romantic partnerships, professional connections. But they're all shallow, performative. You're present physically but absent emotionally. People can't reach you. Not really. They share vulnerably with you, but you can't reciprocate. They try to support you, but you won't let them in. Over time, your relationships become transactional. You help them. They appreciate you. Everyone maintains appropriate distance. Eventually, you wake up and realize you're completely alone, surrounded by people but profoundly isolated. The mechanism: genuine intimacy requires vulnerability. You can't connect deeply while maintaining defensive strength. So your relationships exist at the level of your persona. The mask connects to other masks, but your actual self never touches anyone else's actual self. Jung called this psychic isolation, being relationally present while spiritually absent. Over time, people stop trying to reach you, not consciously. They just sense on some level that you're not available for real connection. They care about you, but they don't really know you, because you won't let yourself be known. Warning signs: having many acquaintances but no one you feel truly close to. Relationships that revolve around you, helping, supporting, or providing for others. Feeling lonely even when surrounded by people. Realizing you haven't had a truly vulnerable conversation in months or years. Noticing that people have stopped asking how you really are. They've learned you'll just say, fine. Real-world example: David was beloved by hundreds. Church leader, community volunteer, everyone's supportive friend. But after his divorce, something became painfully clear. Not one person truly knew him. They knew his service, his humor, his availability. But when he was falling apart, he realized he'd never built relationships where he could be weak, needy, or honestly struggling. He'd created an entire social network based on his strength, and now when he needed support, he was alone. Not because people didn't care, but because he'd never taught anyone how to be there for him. The spiritual cost: humans need genuine connection for psychic health. When you're relationally isolated despite being socially active, your soul has no mirrors, no witnesses, no one reflecting back your actual self because you've never shown it. This accelerates the soul death process, because without genuine intimacy, there's no external pressure to remain human, vulnerable, real. You can fully disappear into your persona, and no one can pull you back out. Danger 4. The Dark Night Crisis. Timeline: usually 5 to 10 years into the progression, can occur suddenly. The fourth stage is the one most people fear, and for good reason. This is catastrophic breakdown, when the defensive structure that's been holding your fragmented psyche together suddenly, completely shatters. It can be triggered by anything that overwhelms your remaining defenses: death of a loved one, job loss or professional failure, relationship ending, milestone birthday that forces awareness of time passing, physical illness that finally breaks your strength. Sometimes it has no obvious trigger. Your psyche has simply reached capacity and can contain the hidden pain no longer. What happens? Complete psychological collapse. The strength you've relied on disappears. You can't function at your normal level. Maybe can't function at all. Severe depression, anxiety, dissociative episodes, suicidal ideation or actual attempts, addiction spirals, hospitalization, medical leave, complete withdrawal from life. Everyone is shocked. You seemed so strong, so together. How could this happen? The mechanism, Jung would say, this isn't new breakdown. This is old pain finally overwhelming the defenses that have been containing it. The dam breaks. Decades of suppressed grief, terror, rage, shame, and need flood consciousness simultaneously. The persona that kept you strong splinters, and underneath it, there's chaos. All the unfelt, unprocessed, unintegrated material you've been hiding from. Warning signs, often ignored until too late. Increasing reliance on substances, behaviors, or distractions to maintain equilibrium. Intrusive suicidal thoughts presented as relief fantasies. Dissociative episodes where you lose time or feel unreal. Sudden inability to perform tasks that were previously easy. Overwhelming sense that you can't do this anymore without knowing what this is. Real-world example. Anthony Bourdain and Robin Williams. Both appeared strong, successful, beloved. Both hid profound pain behind personas of strength, humor, and capability. Both reached the catastrophic stage where suppressed pain overwhelmed all defenses simultaneously. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. When the breakdown finally comes, it's total, because it's not just current stress. It's every unfelt feeling from a lifetime erupting at once. The spiritual cost. This stage is life-threatening. People die here from suicide, from self-destructive behaviors, from the sheer overwhelm of finally feeling everything they've avoided feeling for decades. Even those who survive often require hospitalization, intensive treatment, complete life restructuring. The tragedy, all of this could have been prevented if the spiritual clues in earlier stages had been heeded, if conscious vulnerability had been chosen before catastrophic collapse forced it. But for people living from defensive strength, this stage often feels like it comes from nowhere. They had no idea how close to breakdown they were, because they'd spent their entire lives not knowing. Danger 5. Soul death before physical death. Timeline can persist for years or decades. If stage 4 is survived without integration, the final stage is the most devastating because it's the worst outcome other than literal death. This is what happens when someone survives catastrophic breakdown but never does the integration work. They stabilize, get out of crisis, maybe return to functioning, but they never truly return to life. Jung called this living death, existing physically while being dead spiritually, emotionally, and psychically. What it looks like: going through daily motions with no internal aliveness, feeling like a ghost inhabiting your own life. Complete emotional numbness, not just to pain but to joy, meaning, connection, everything. Existing but not living, breathing but not alive. People who reach this stage often describe themselves as checked out, not really here, or just waiting. They're not suicidal, they're too numb even for that. They're just empty. The mechanism. The psyche tried everything to force consciousness. Spiritual clues, physical symptoms, relational isolation, catastrophic crisis. Nothing worked. The person survived but never chose to actually feel the hidden pain. So the soul finally gives up. It stops trying to communicate. It withdraws completely, not in death, but in what Jung called departure of the soul from life. The person becomes a walking corpse, mechanically functional but spiritually absent. Warning signs, describing life as fine with complete emotional flatness, no desire for growth, change, or deepening, relationships maintained out of obligation with no genuine feeling, complete absence of passion, curiosity, or engagement with life, feeling like you're observing your life from outside rather than living it. Real-world example. Jung encountered many patients in this state, people who came to therapy not because they were in crisis, but because they felt dead inside. They functioned well enough, but they felt nothing. One patient described it. I go to work, I come home, I speak to my family, I fulfill my responsibilities, but I feel like I'm watching someone else's life. I haven't felt actual joy or actual pain in so long, I can't remember what feeling feels like. I exist, but I'm not alive. Jung understood. This patient had successfully avoided the catastrophic breakdown, but the cost was soul death. The defensive strength had become total armor. Nothing could get in, including life itself. The spiritual cost. This is the ultimate tragedy of ignoring your soul's clues. You survive physically, but you lose yourself. The person you could have been, vulnerable, alive, authentically strong through integration rather than defense, never gets to exist. You live decades as a shadow of yourself, safe from breakdown, but safe from everything else too. Jung wrote, "The greatest tragedy is not death, but a life unlived." And I have seen many patients who chose safety over life, strength over soul, and ended up with a heartbeat but no heart. These 5 stages aren't inevitable. They're what happens when spiritual clues are continuously ignored, when hidden pain remains hidden, when defensive strength is maintained despite the soul's increasingly desperate attempts to force consciousness. Jung discovered that, at any stage, the progression could be interrupted if the person finally chose conscious vulnerability, if they finally acknowledged that their strength was hiding unbearable pain, if they finally allowed themselves to feel what they'd spent their life avoiding. But the choice becomes harder at each stage, because the defensive structure becomes more entrenched, the identity more rigid, the fear of breakdown more intense. By stage 4, breakthrough and breakdown become indistinguishable. By stage 5, even breakthrough might be impossible. The soul has departed, and calling it back requires extraordinary circumstances. This is why Jung emphasized early recognition of spiritual clues, why he taught that conscious, chosen vulnerability is infinitely preferable to unconscious, forced breakdown, why he insisted that strength must be integrated with weakness to be real, because he'd seen the alternative, the 5 stages of soul death, the slow extinction of human aliveness, the tragedy of people who survived everything except their own defenses. If you recognize yourself in the earlier stages, spiritual disconnection, mysterious physical symptoms, relational isolation, Jung's message is urgent. Choose now. Choose consciousness before your psyche forces it catastrophically. Choose feeling before numbness becomes permanent. Choose vulnerability before your soul gives up trying to reach you, because once you reach the final stages, choosing becomes exponentially harder, and some people never find their way back. Jung offered something radical, something most therapies still don't fully understand. He didn't say, get stronger. He didn't say, think differently. He didn't even say, feel your feelings. He said, you must consciously break down before your psyche breaks you down unconsciously. The solution to pain hidden behind strength isn't more strength. It's sacred vulnerability, chosen, conscious, supported descent into the very pain your defensive structure was built to avoid. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious. Modern psychology might call it therapeutic breakdown, but Jung understood it as something more profound, a spiritual initiation where the false self dies so the true self can be born. This isn't collapse as failure, it's dissolution as transformation, and Jung mapped the process with precision. Component 1. Honoring the strength. Jung's first principle is counterintuitive. Before you can release defensive strength, you must honor it, deeply, completely, without shame or judgment. Because here's what most people, including many therapists, get wrong. They treat defensive strength as the problem. Jung saw it as a miracle. That strength saved you when you were too young to process unbearable pain, when no help was coming, when you had to survive circumstances that would have destroyed a less resilient psyche. Your defensive structure emerged to protect you. It wasn't pathology, it was brilliant adaptation. The child who became prematurely responsible because their parent couldn't function, that strength enabled survival. The teenager who disconnected from emotions after trauma, that dissociation prevented psychotic breakdown. The adult who developed unshakable composure, that persona held their fragmented self together when nothing else could. Jung insisted, you cannot dismantle what you haven't first honored. The practice. Begin by acknowledging out loud or in writing, my strength has served me. It protected me when I was too vulnerable to protect myself. It enabled me to function when I should have been broken. It saved my life. Feel the truth of this, not intellectually, emotionally. Your defensive structure deserves gratitude, not condemnation. Then and only then can you add, but what saved me in childhood is imprisoning me in adulthood. The strength that protected me is now preventing my wholeness. It's time to release the defense, not because it was bad, but because its job is complete. Jung observed that people who tried to break through their defenses without this honoring step often experienced more violent psychological collapse, because the psyche will defend what feels attacked. But when you honor your strength first, you create the possibility of letting it go without warfare. Component 2. The controlled descent. Jung's second principle, conscious breakdown must happen in a safe container. You cannot simply remove all defenses and hope consciousness can handle the flood. That's not therapeutic, it's re-traumatizing. Instead, Jung taught the art of titrated vulnerability, creating structured spaces where hidden pain can surface in doses the psyche can integrate. The containers Jung identified: therapeutic relationship, a skilled therapist or analyst who can witness your breakdown without fixing, analyzing, or being overwhelmed by it. Jung emphasized that the therapist must be able to hold space for profound regression, rage, grief, and terror without trying to restore the client's strength prematurely. Trusted, intimate, one person, partner, friend, spiritual guide, with whom you commit to radical honesty, not performing strength, not minimizing pain, actually allowing yourself to be seen falling apart. Sacred solitude, deliberate periods of withdrawal where external demands are removed. Jung often recommended patients take weeks or months of retreat from normal life when possible, creating space for the unconscious to emerge without the pressure to keep functioning. Structured practice, regular, non-negotiable time for inner work. Jung's patients engaged in active imagination, dream work, and what he called confrontation sessions, deliberately invoking the wounded parts and allowing them to speak. The method: choose one or more containers, commit to them absolutely, then within those containers, begin the descent. Allow yourself to feel weak, needy, or incompetent without immediately restoring composure. Share honestly about your struggles without minimizing or qualifying them with, but I'm handling it. Cry without stopping yourself. Rage without controlling yourself. Express need without shame. The key: these experiences happen in contained spaces, not everywhere simultaneously. You're not abandoning all functioning. You're creating protected zones where your soul can finally express what your strength has been suppressing. Jung wrote, "The patient must learn to be consciously weak in the presence of another and discover that this weakness does not destroy them. Only then can they integrate vulnerability into their personality rather than continuing to exile it to the shadow." Component 3. Shadow integration of weakness. Jung's third principle addresses the core issue: all the vulnerable parts of yourself that you exiled to become strong. The needy child who wanted care, the frightened one who felt overwhelmed, the helpless victim who couldn't fix the situation, the rageful one who wanted revenge, the despairing one who wanted to give up. These aren't enemies to be overcome. They're exiled aspects of your wholeness that must be reclaimed. Jung called this shadow integration, dialoguing with, understanding, and ultimately embracing the parts of yourself consciousness has rejected. The practice: use Jung's active imagination technique specifically for the weak shadow. Sit quietly and invite the disowned part to appear in imagination. It might appear as a younger version of you, an archetypal figure, or simply as a feeling presence. Ask it questions. Who are you? What do you need? What have you been trying to tell me? What happens if I continue rejecting you? Let it respond through images, words, or feelings. Don't analyze or interpret in the moment. Just witness and record. Jung found that exiled parts often carry shocking messages. I'm the part of you that's still 6 years old, waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to be strong anymore." I'm your rage at being forced into premature responsibility. I'm not going away until you finally feel me. I'm your terror that if you're not perfect, you'll be abandoned. I've been running your life from the shadows. The goal isn't to eliminate these parts, it's to integrate them, acknowledging that you are both strong and weak, both capable and needy, both composed and terrified. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Jung taught that true strength emerges from integration, not from the exclusion of weakness. The person who can acknowledge, "I'm capable and I need help," is stronger than the person who must maintain, "I'm always capable," because the latter is living from ego defense. The former is living from integrated wholeness. Component 4. Somatic release. Work Jung's fourth principle recognizes something crucial. Pain doesn't just live in your mind or memories. It lives in your body. And talking about pain doesn't release it. You have to feel it somatically, in the body, for actual integration to occur. Jung observed that patients could have profound intellectual insights about their trauma without any emotional or somatic release. They could know they were wounded without feeling the wound. This is what happened with Frida initially. She could describe her pain with clinical accuracy, but it remained imprisoned in her body until it finally erupted. The mechanism, trauma and suppressed emotion, create chronic muscular tension, altered breathing patterns, and stuck energy in the body. Your body has been bracing against feeling for years or decades. That bracing must be released for the pain to move through you rather than staying lodged in you. The practices Jung used and recommended: breathwork, deep, conscious breathing that overrides the shallow breathing of chronic defense. When you've been suppressing emotion, you've also been suppressing breath. Full breathing brings suppressed feeling to the surface. Movement, allowing the body to express what words cannot. Shaking, trembling, rocking, spontaneous movement that releases held tension. Touch, massage, somatic experiencing, body-centered therapy that locates where pain is stored physically and provides permission for release. Physical purging, In extreme cases, Jung observed that patients needed to literally vomit, wail, or physically discharge the accumulated pain their bodies had been holding. Jung wrote, "I have seen patients talk about their childhood for years without change, but when they finally allowed their body to express the terror, rage, or grief they'd been holding, when they sobbed until they couldn't breathe, when they shook uncontrollably, when they curled into fetal position and wailed, transformation occurred in minutes that years of analysis hadn't touched." The warning: somatic release must happen in safe containers. You need someone present who won't try to stop the release, calm you down prematurely, or fix you. The temptation for both you and others is to restore composure quickly, but that's just rebuilding the prison. Real release means allowing the body to complete its expressions of pain fully, even when it's intense, messy, and uncomfortable to witness. Component 5. Dream work and active imagination. Jung's fifth principle leverages the soul's own language, symbols, images, and imagination. Remember, your soul has been trying to communicate hidden pain through dreams and synchronicities. Now you're going to consciously engage with that communication. Dream work practice: keep a journal by your bed. Record dreams immediately upon waking, especially recurring dreams or nightmares. Rather than analyzing them intellectually, enter into them imaginatively. If you dream of drowning, imagine the dream continuing. What happens if you stop fighting the water? If you dream of being chased, imagine turning to face the pursuer. What does it want? If you dream of being unable to speak, imagine your voice returning. What would you say? Jung called this dream amplification, expanding the dream through active imagination to let it complete its message. Active imagination practice. This is Jung's most powerful technique for accessing unconscious material. Sit in a quiet space. Allow an image, figure, or feeling to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious. Engage with it as if it's real. Dialogue with it. Ask questions. Let it show you things. Critically, do not direct the imagination consciously. Let the unconscious lead. Jung used this during his own breakdown to encounter autonomous figures, Philemon, Salome, various archetypal presences who taught him about the pain he'd been hiding. For those with hidden pain behind strength, active imagination often brings forward the wounded child who never received care, the rageful adolescent who was forced to be mature too early, the desperate part begging to finally stop being strong, the wise figure showing you what you've been avoiding. The key: these aren't just imagination. Jung insisted they're autonomous aspects of the psyche with their own intelligence. By engaging them consciously, you're allowing the soul to teach you what your conscious mind refuses to learn. Component 6. Witnessing and mirroring Jung's sixth principle. You cannot fully integrate alone. Healing requires at least one relationship where you're witnessed in your vulnerability without shame, fixing, or abandonment. This is different from traditional support. What witnessing means: someone who can be present with your pain without needing to make it better. Someone who can see you falling apart without being threatened by it. Someone who reflects back: I see you suffering and you're not broken. You're human. Jung called this the temenos, sacred space where transformation can occur because it's held by another consciousness. Why this matters: people with defensive strength usually develop that defense because vulnerability brought danger in childhood. They learned, if I show weakness, I'll be abandoned, shamed, or hurt. Healing requires a corrective experience. When I show weakness to this person, I'm met with empathy, not rejection. This rewires the attachment system. It teaches the psyche that vulnerability is survivable, that weakness doesn't equal destruction. The practice: find one person, therapist, close friend, partner, spiritual director, and make an explicit agreement. I'm going to practice being vulnerable with you in ways I never have before. I need you to witness without fixing, to stay present without rescuing, to let me be weak without trying to make me strong again. Then, consistently, bring your actual internal state to this person. The exhaustion, the fear, the need, the helplessness, the rage, all of it. Without performance, without minimizing, without quickly reassuring them or yourself that you're actually fine. Jung observed that patients often resisted this fiercely. Vulnerability with another person felt more terrifying than any inner work. But he insisted, the shadow cannot be integrated in isolation. It must be seen by another and accepted. Only then can you accept it yourself. Component 7. The alchemical transformation. Jung's final principle frames the entire process as spiritual alchemy, ancient language for psychological transformation, the stages, nigredo, blackening, the necessary death of the false self. Everything you thought you were, the strong one, the capable one, the one who has it together, must dissolve. This is the darkest phase where you feel like you're losing yourself. You are, but you're losing what was never real. Albedo, whitening, purification through feeling. The hidden pain surfaces, grief, rage, terror, shame. Rather than suppressing it again, you allow it to move through you. This is the cathartic release, the cleansing, synchronicities, yellowing, the dawn of insight. After feeling the pain, consciousness begins to understand its meaning, why the defense formed, what the wound actually was, how the pattern has operated your entire life. Rubedo, reddening, integration and embodiment. You rebuild identity, but this time on the foundation of wholeness rather than defense. You develop genuine strength that includes vulnerability, authentic capability that acknowledges limitation, real resilience that makes space for breaking. The key insight: you must go through nigredo, the dark night, the breakdown, the death of defensive identity. You cannot skip to rubedo, integrated strength, without the dissolution. Jung wrote, "The greatest mistake is trying to transform without breaking down. People want to add vulnerability to their strength, to expand their personality without dismantling it. But alchemy teaches, solve et coagula, dissolve and reconstruct. You cannot have the gold without first descending into the blackness and allowing what you were to die." This is why Jung called it sacred breakdown, not because breaking down is fun, but because it's holy. It's the death that precedes resurrection. Jung's complete solution can be summarized: honor the defense that saved you, create safe containers for controlled descent, reclaim the exiled parts of yourself, release pain through the body, not just the mind, engage your soul through its own language of symbol and image. Allow yourself to be witnessed in vulnerability. Trust the alchemical process of dissolution and reconstruction. This isn't quick. Jung estimated genuine integration takes 2 to 5 years of consistent inner work, not because the pain takes that long to feel, but because rebuilding identity on a foundation of wholeness rather than defense is a gradual process. But Jung made one thing absolutely clear: this work, difficult, terrifying, and ego-destroying as it is infinitely preferable to the alternative. Catastrophic breakdown forces the same process without choice, without containers, without support, or worse, avoiding breakdown entirely and living the rest of your life as a walking corpse, mechanically strong but spiritually dead. Jung offered a third path: conscious vulnerability, sacred breakdown, chosen transformation. It requires courage most people don't believe they have, but Jung would tell you, the courage is already there. You've been using it to maintain your defensive strength for decades. Now you just have to redirect it from defending against your pain to finally feeling it and discovering that what you feared would destroy you actually completes you. Jung's framework becomes clearer when we see it lived out, or tragically, not lived out, in real human stories. 4 lives. 4 people who hid profound pain behind remarkable strength. 2 who maintained their defenses until catastrophic destruction. 2 who chose conscious vulnerability and transformed their suffering into integrated wholeness. The contrast reveals everything. Failure Case 1. Robin Williams, the healer who couldn't heal himself. Robin Williams was the ultimate strong one, the person everyone leaned on, the one who made the world laugh while carrying unbearable pain. From childhood, Robin learned to use humor as armor, making his mother laugh to ease her depression, entertaining classmates to avoid bullying, becoming the funny one because it was safer than being the frightened one. By adulthood, this defensive structure had become complete identity. He was on constantly. Friends described him as incapable of not performing, unable to simply be without entertaining. The persona had consumed the person, but the spiritual clues were everywhere. Severe addiction, cocaine, alcohol, using substances to numb the pain humor couldn't mask. Profound depression, described by those close to him as darkness that would descend without warning. Exhaustion, despite success, despite adoration, feeling empty and depleted. Failed relationships, 3 marriages with partners describing him as emotionally unreachable beneath the performance. And the dreams, Williams once mentioned recurring nightmares of drowning, of being unable to breathe, of something dark pursuing him. Classic Jungian symbols of the unconscious, overwhelming consciousness. But Robin couldn't stop, couldn't let go of the strength persona, because that persona had become his survival mechanism. Without it, who was he? The frightened child, the depressed one, the weak one. Unthinkable. Jung would recognize the pattern immediately. Robin was living from a compensatory persona so complete that the real self had essentially disappeared. He'd become the mask, and beneath the mask was the pain he'd been running from since childhood, never feeling good enough, never feeling truly loved for himself rather than his performance, carrying everyone's emotional weight, while his own went unacknowledged. When the darkness finally overwhelmed his defenses, when the depression became too severe to mask, Robin Williams took his own life. The world was shocked. How could someone so talented, so beloved, so seemingly alive be dying inside? Jung would answer, because his aliveness was performance, not presence. His strength was defense, not integration. And when you live from defensive persona for decades, the hidden pain doesn't diminish. It accumulates, until the day it becomes unbearable. What Robin Williams needed: permission to stop performing, space to feel weak, needy, depressed without shame, relationships where he could be the one being cared for, not always the caretaker, conscious descent into the pain he'd been masking with humor for 60 years. But he never got there, or perhaps he tried. His friends report he'd been in therapy, seeking help, but it was too late. The defensive structure had held for so long that its collapse was catastrophic rather than transformative. Jung's lesson from cases like Robin's: if you wait until crisis to do integration work, the pain may overwhelm consciousness before consciousness can integrate it. Chosen vulnerability must come before forced breakdown. Failure Case 2. Anthony Bourdain, the fearless mask. Anthony Bourdain presented as the opposite of defensive strength. He appeared raw, honest, unfiltered, traveling the world, trying everything, sharing his struggles with addiction openly, but Jung would see through the facade. Bourdain's honesty was selective. He shared about past addiction, but that was safe, already resolved, part of his origin story. He shared observations about the world, but deflected from present internal struggle. He presented as fearless, but that fearlessness was itself a defense against acknowledging current fear. The real clues: relentless productivity, constant travel, constant filming, inability to stop and simply be, failed intimate relationships, 3 marriages, patterns of idealization followed by withdrawal, substance use continuing in controlled ways. He wasn't sober, just not as destructive as before. Rage that leaked through his writing, anger at inequality, at injustice, but also at himself. Comments from friends that beneath the adventurous exterior was profound loneliness and self-loathing. Bourdain had constructed a strong persona based on being the experienced, worldly, unshakable traveler. Nothing intimidated him. Nothing was too intense. He could handle anything. But this was compensation for the wounded person underneath, the one who felt like a fraud, who struggled with intimacy, who carried childhood wounds of abandonment and parental dysfunction that he rarely addressed directly. In Jung's language, Bourdain had integrated his shadow just enough to seem authentic, but not enough to actually heal. He'd made his wounds part of his persona. I'm the damaged one who's seen it all, without actually doing the deeper work of feeling and integrating the pain. When his last relationship ended, when the protective identity cracked, the hidden pain erupted, and like Robin Williams, Bourdain took his own life. What Anthony Bourdain needed: to recognize that talking about pain isn't the same as feeling it, to understand that controlled risk-taking and adventure were keeping him running from the stillness where real feeling lives, to stop using radical honesty as another form of performance and actually allow himself to be vulnerably, messily human, to build one relationship where he didn't have to be the experienced, fearless one, where he could be scared, needy, uncertain, but he maintained the persona until it failed him. Jung wrote about cases like this. Some people confess their sins publicly as a way of avoiding genuine repentance privately. They perform vulnerability rather than living it. Bourdain performed vulnerability brilliantly, but performance isn't integration, and eventually the unperformed pain caught up with him. Success, Case 1, Brené Brown, the researcher who became her research. Brené Brown's story is Jung's solution lived out in real time. She started as a researcher studying shame, vulnerability, and human connection. Classic defensive position, investigating others' vulnerability while maintaining her own composure. She was the strong one: PhD, tenure track, successful career, controlled life. But during her research, something happened that Jung would recognize immediately. The content she was studying in others began surfacing in herself. She encountered her own defensive patterns, using achievement to prove worth, maintaining control to feel safe, avoiding vulnerability while studying it academically. And she had a choice. She could have continued from defensive position, writing about vulnerability while never actually being vulnerable herself. Many academics do exactly this, but Brown chose something different. She chose conscious breakdown. She describes this period as the breakdown breakthrough. Everything she'd been using to feel secure, certainty, control, academic detachment, crumbled. She had to confront her own unworthiness feelings, her need to control outcomes, her terror of being seen as imperfect, her use of professional success to compensate for personal insecurity, and instead of rebuilding the same defensive structure, she integrated the process. She acknowledged that her research was actually her own pain calling for recognition. She allowed herself to feel shame, inadequacy, and vulnerability rather than just studying them. She shared her process publicly, not as performance, but as genuine integration work. She rebuilt her professional work on the foundation of her own vulnerability rather than despite it. The result? Her work exploded in influence precisely because it came from integrated wholeness rather than defensive strength. People recognized authenticity. She wasn't presenting as the expert who'd mastered vulnerability. She was presenting as someone walking the path alongside others, sharing both the struggle and the transformation. Jung would call this successful individuation. Brown integrated the shadow, her own vulnerability and shame, released the defensive persona, the controlled academic, and rebuilt identity on the foundation of wholeness rather than compensation. What made Brown's transformation successful? She recognized the spiritual clues early. Her research topics were her soul trying to show her what she needed to address in herself. She chose conscious vulnerability before catastrophic crisis forced it. She had containers, therapy, trusted relationships, for safe descent. She allowed the process to be public, accepting the risk of being seen in her imperfection. Most importantly, she didn't try to add vulnerability to her existing persona. She allowed the persona to die and rebuilt from integrated ground. This is the difference between failure and success in Jung's framework. Williams and Bourdain tried to maintain their personas while managing pain. Brown allowed her persona to dissolve and rebuilt from authenticity. Success, case 2, Carl Jung himself, the psychiatrist's descent. Jung's own story is the template for sacred breakdown. Before his breakdown, 1913-1916, Jung appeared supremely strong, brilliant psychiatrist, Freud's chosen successor, international reputation, successful family, complete professional confidence. But beneath this, his soul was fragmenting and sending clues he initially ignored, disturbing visions he dismissed as fantasy, growing discomfort with psychoanalytic orthodoxy that he suppressed, increasing sense of meaninglessness despite external success, physical symptoms, and strange dreams. The break with Freud triggered the crisis Jung had been approaching for years. Suddenly, his entire professional identity as Freud's protege, as a psychoanalyst, as someone who had the answers, collapsed. And underneath was chaos. Jung experienced what he feared was psychosis, vivid visions of destruction and transformation, autonomous figures appearing in imagination, voices speaking to him, overwhelming emotions and archetypal material flooding consciousness. He could have sought to restore his former strength, rebuilt his defenses, dismissed the experiences as pathology. Instead, Jung did something remarkable. He chose to descend further. The process. He resigned his university position, releasing external identity. He withdrew from professional commitments, creating space for inner work. He began the practice that became active imagination, consciously engaging the unconscious rather than defending against it. He kept detailed records in what became the Red Book, witnessing his own process. He allowed himself to be weak, confused, uncertain, the opposite of the expert. What Jung discovered during this descent, his professional strength had been compensation for childhood wounds, a depressed mother, an absent father, early spiritual experiences that were dismissed. His identification with being the knower was preventing him from experiencing the mystery. The visions and figures weren't psychosis. They were his soul trying to teach him what consciousness couldn't learn through intellect alone. The pain he'd been hiding was grief. Grief for his childhood. Grief for parts of himself he'd exiled to become a respectable scientist. Jung's breakdown lasted years, but it wasn't catastrophic collapse. It was controlled descent with conscious witnessing. He maintained just enough ego structure to observe the process, while allowing enough dissolution for transformation. The result, Jung emerged with his life's work, the theory of individuation, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the shadow. All of it came from his willingness to consciously fall apart. More importantly, he emerged as an integrated person. His later strength wasn't defensive, it was authentic. He could be both brilliant analyst and mystic visionary, both rational scientist and spiritual seeker, both strong and vulnerable. Jung wrote afterward, "The years when I pursued my inner images were the most important of my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements." What made Jung's transformation successful? He recognized the breakdown as necessary rather than pathological. He created containers, his practice, his journals, his ongoing work, to hold the process. He allowed the professional persona to die, the expert, the heir to Freud, the one with answers. He engaged the unconscious on its own terms rather than trying to control it. Most critically, he integrated the experience into his life's work rather than treating it as something to get over. Jung's breakdown became his breakthrough, became his contribution to humanity. This is the promise of conscious vulnerability. What threatens to destroy you can become what transforms you, if you meet it consciously rather than defending against it. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Williams and Bourdain maintained defensive strength until catastrophic collapse. The pain they'd been hiding consumed them before they could integrate it. Tragedy. Brown and Jung chose conscious vulnerability before crisis forced it, allowed personas to die, integrated hidden pain, rebuilt on authentic foundation, transformation. Same starting point, pain hidden behind strength. Different choices, defend until destruction versus consciously descend. Different outcomes, death, literal or psychic, versus integrated wholeness. Jung's lesson from these contrasts: the pain will surface eventually. The only question is whether you choose to meet it consciously, with support, containers, gradual integration, or whether you maintain defenses until your psyche has no option but to shatter them catastrophically. Those who choose consciousness early enough can transform. Those who defend too long risk destruction. The path of sacred breakdown isn't easy, but it's survivable, workable, transformative. The path of maintained defense until catastrophic collapse, sometimes that's not survivable at all. To truly understand what Jung is asking of you, to consciously descend into hidden pain, to allow defensive strength to dissolve, to risk psychological breakdown for the possibility of integration, you need to know that Jung himself walked this terrifying path. Not theoretically, not as an observer of patients, but personally, intimately, nearly fatally. The years 1913 to 1916 represent Jung's own confrontation with the pain he'd been hiding behind professional strength, and he almost didn't survive it. The perfect facade. Before his breakdown, Carl Jung appeared to have it all together. By 1912, at age 37, he was the director of Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital, a brilliant lecturer at the University of Zurich, Sigmund Freud's chosen successor and heir apparent to psychoanalysis, author of groundbreaking work on word association and complex theory, husband and father to a growing family, respected, successful, ascending. Everything pointed toward conventional achievement and professional dominance, but Jung was fragmenting underneath. The spiritual clues were already present, though he was dismissing them. Disturbing dreams he couldn't fully explain. Growing discomfort with Freud's reductionist theories, which he suppressed to maintain the relationship. Visions and fantasies that intruded during ordinary consciousness. A sense that something essential was missing despite external success. Physical symptoms, headaches, digestive issues, inexplicable fatigue. Jung later recognized these as his soul's attempts to communicate what his professional persona refused to acknowledge. But he was too invested in being strong, the capable one, the brilliant psychiatrist, the man with answers. The trigger, loss of identity. In 1913, Jung's relationship with Freud deteriorated and finally severed completely. This wasn't just a professional disagreement. For Jung, it was the collapse of his primary identity structure. He'd been Freud's successor. His professional standing, his sense of purpose, his understanding of psychology, all were built on this foundation. When that foundation crumbled, everything built upon it began to crack. Jung described it. After the break with Freud, all my friends and acquaintances dropped away. My book was declared to be rubbish. I was a mystic, and that settled the matter. I felt totally suspended in midair, for I had not yet found my own ground. His defensive structure, brilliant professional, respected scientist, Freud's protégé, suddenly had no support, and underneath was the chaos he'd been defending against his entire life. The descent begins. In late 1913, Jung began experiencing what he feared was the onset of psychosis. Vivid, overwhelming visions would overtake him without warning, images of Europe drowning in blood, catastrophic destruction spreading across the continent, death and transformation symbolism flooding his consciousness. He wrote, "I was living in a constant state of tension. Often I felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me." When World War I broke out in 1914, Jung realized his visions had been prophetic, not about external events only, but about his own internal apocalypse that had to occur. The external war mirrored his internal warfare, the battle between his conscious strength and his unconscious pain. Jung faced a choice: seek psychiatric treatment and potentially be diagnosed psychotic, ending his career, suppress the experiences and rebuild his professional defenses, or consciously descend into whatever his psyche was trying to show him. He chose descent. Confrontation with the unconscious. Jung's method was revolutionary and terrifying. He deliberately allowed himself to fall into the visions rather than defending against them. He engaged in what he called active imagination, consciously participating in unconscious fantasies as if they were real encounters. He recorded everything in journals that would later become the Red Book, detailed accounts of his descent into psychological underworld. What he encountered defied ordinary reality. Autonomous figures who spoke to him with their own intelligence. Philemon, an old man with wisdom Jung didn't consciously possess. Salome, representing Eros and the feminine. The Red One, a devil figure embodying shadow. Journeys through symbolic landscapes, caves, deserts, underground realms representing layers of the unconscious. Confrontations with archetypal energies, gods, demons, wise figures, terrifying presences, overwhelming emotions, rage he didn't know he had, grief he'd never acknowledged, terror that felt inhuman in its intensity. Jung described one encounter. "I was walking down a long descent with a dwarf made of metal, a gnome. We came to a glowing red stone. The dwarf disappeared. Suddenly I heard a voice crying, 'Everything must be ruled by the light.' I knew this was my voice, the voice of my conscious self. But another voice answered, 'You cannot rule the darkness. You can only befriend it.'" These weren't mere fantasies. They were autonomous psychic realities forcing Jung to confront what his professional persona had exiled. The hidden pain surfaces. As Jung descended deeper, the real wounds began surfacing. Childhood isolation. He'd been a profoundly lonely child, his mother depressed and emotionally absent for much of his early life. His father a pastor who'd lost his faith but continued performing the role, leaving young Carl surrounded by religious forms emptied of genuine spirituality. Early spiritual wounding. Jung had mystical experiences as a child that he learned to hide because they were unacceptable, teaching him that his deepest authentic self must be concealed to be acceptable. The compensatory persona. His entire professional identity, rational, scientific, analytical, was built to compensate for and suppress these early mystical experiences and emotional wounds. Suppressed rage, anger at his mother for her absence, at his father for his inauthenticity, at the church for dead religiosity, at himself for betraying his own spiritual nature to become academically respectable. The wounded masculine, Jung discovered he'd exiled his own vulnerability, emotion, and mystical capacity to embody a rigid patriarchal masculinity that felt safe but left him fragmented. Existential terror. Beneath the professional confidence was profound fear that life was meaningless, that his work didn't matter, that he'd wasted years in service to Freud's reductionist theories while betraying his own deeper knowing. Jung wrote, "The wealth of the soul exists in images. He who possesses the images of the world possesses half the world, even if his humanity and his daily bread seem lost." He was discovering that in becoming the rational scientist, he'd lost his soul, and his soul was demanding to be reclaimed. Through breakdown, the dark night. The years 1914-1915 were Jung's darkest. He described feeling on the edge of madness constantly. He couldn't maintain normal professional functioning. His family was bewildered and frightened. Their husband and father had become someone unrecognizable, withdrawn, consumed by inner visions. His colleagues assumed he'd had a breakdown and would never recover his standing. Jung himself wasn't sure he'd survive. The ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depths. I frequently imagined a catastrophe that might overtake me. The idea of the fall especially preoccupied me. There were times when I stood before an abyss, and my hair stood on end. This was the nigredo, the alchemical blackening, the necessary death. Everything Jung had built his identity on was dissolving, his professional standing gone, his certainty about psychology shattered, his rational, controlled self overwhelmed by irrational forces, his sense of being the expert replaced by being a confused beginner exploring unknown territory. But Jung maintained just enough ego structure to witness the process. He kept working with patience. The act of helping others seemed to ground him. He continued recording his visions. Documentation became a lifeline to sanity. He stayed connected to his family. Even as he withdrew emotionally, he maintained minimal functioning. This is the critical difference between catastrophic breakdown and sacred descent. Jung was falling apart consciously, with containers, with witness, with enough structure to prevent complete psychotic disintegration while allowing enough dissolution for transformation. The crucial discoveries. Through this descent, Jung made discoveries that became foundational to his life's work, the collective unconscious. By descending into his personal unconscious, Jung encountered material that wasn't personal, archetypal patterns, universal symbols, collective human experiences. This became his theory of the collective unconscious, the reality of the psyche. Jung discovered that psychic realities, the figures, the visions, the autonomous voices, were as real as physical reality, not hallucinations to be dismissed, but actual phenomena to be engaged. The necessity of shadow integration. Jung confronted his own shadow, the parts he'd exiled to become respectable. His rage, his irrationality, his mysticism, his weakness. He couldn't transcend them. He had to integrate them. The wounded healer archetype. Jung realized his wounds weren't obstacles to his work. They were the source of his work. His breakthrough became his gift to psychology. The individuation process. The entire ordeal taught Jung that becoming whole, individuation, requires consciously descending into fragmentation, feeling the pain of the false self dying and rebuilding identity on authentic foundation rather than defensive compensation. Most importantly for our purposes, Jung discovered that his professional strength, the brilliant, rational, controlled psychiatrist, had been hiding profound childhood pain, spiritual wounds, and existential terror. His soul had been trying to surface this material for years through dreams, symptoms, and synchronicities, but he'd been too identified with being strong to listen. The break with Freud and the onset of World War I provided the crisis that finally shattered his defenses, and rather than rebuilding them, Jung chose to descend into what they'd been protecting him from. The integration phase. By 1916, Jung began emerging from the darkest depths, not recovered in the sense of returning to his former self, transformed. He'd integrated the material that surfaced during his descent, the mystic and the scientist. Jung could now hold both, rational investigation and spiritual experience, analysis and mysticism, science and soul, strength and vulnerability. He no longer needed to be the expert with all answers. He could be the seeker, the student, the one still learning, the personal and collective. His own wounds had connected him to universal human suffering, making his psychology deeper and more applicable, conscious and unconscious. Rather than consciousness defending against the unconscious, Jung developed a relationship with it, ongoing dialogue through active imagination, dream work, and symbolic engagement. The work he produced after this integration became his most important contributions. Psychological Types, 1921, developing his theory of personality and psychological functions. The Red Book, completed 1930, published posthumously, 2009, the detailed record of his descent and transformation. His mature theories on individuation, the self, synchronicity, and archetypal psychology, all rooted in his willingness to consciously break down. Jung later reflected, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. And critically, I had to accept that I could not succeed in understanding the unconscious solely from reason. I had to let myself be carried along by the current without a notion of where it would lead me." What Jung's story reveals, his personal breakdown validates everything he taught about hidden pain behind strength. The strongest facade often hides the deepest wounds. Jung appeared supremely capable and confident. Underneath was childhood trauma, spiritual wounding, and existential terror he'd been compensating for through professional achievement. The soul sends clues before forcing crisis. Jung had years of dreams, visions, and symptoms warning him. He ignored them until his psyche forced the confrontation. Defensive strength must dissolve for integration to occur. Jung couldn't add vulnerability to his existing persona. The professional identity had to die for the authentic self to emerge. The process is terrifying but survivable. Jung feared psychosis and professional ruin, but by descending consciously with containers and witness, he survived and transformed. Integration produces genuine strength. After his breakdown, Jung's strength was real, not defensive compensation but integrated capacity that included vulnerability, mystery, and humility. Your wounds become your gift. Jung's breakdown became the source of his most important work. What nearly destroyed him became what he contributed to humanity. Most importantly for you, Jung is proof that the path he's asking you to walk, conscious descent into hidden pain, sacred breakdown of defensive strength, integration through feeling rather than defending, is not only possible, but transformative. The man who became the 20th century's most influential depth psychologist did so precisely because he chose to consciously fall apart, rather than maintaining his defensive structure until catastrophic collapse. The warning and the promise. Jung's story contains both warning and promise. The warning, if Jung, a trained psychiatrist, someone who understood the psyche professionally, nearly lost himself in the descent, how much more dangerous is it for people who maintain defensive strength without any understanding of what they're defending against? Jung had containers: his psychological training, his practice, his journals, his ongoing work with patients. Most people have none of these when their defenses finally crack, which is why Jung emphasized early recognition of spiritual clues and conscious supported descent rather than waiting for catastrophic crisis. The promise: if the descent is undertaken consciously, with support, with containers, with willingness to feel rather than defend, transformation is not only possible but inevitable. Jung emerged from his breakdown more himself than he'd ever been, not despite his descent, but because of it. The false self died, the true self was born, and everything he contributed to psychology, to understanding the human soul, to helping millions of people understand their own journeys, all of it came from his willingness to consciously break down. Jung wrote to those facing similar descents, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And finally, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Jung became who he truly was by allowing who he pretended to be to die, by descending into the pain his professional strength had been hiding, by choosing consciousness over defense, by trusting that dissolution would lead to reconstruction. This is what he's asking of you, not because he's cruel or doesn't understand how terrifying it is, but because he walked this path himself, nearly lost himself in it, and emerged with the absolute conviction that this is the only way to genuine wholeness. Through the breakdown you're avoiding, into the pain you're hiding, toward the integration that can only come from finally feeling what you've spent your life being too strong to feel. Theory matters, understanding matters, but transformation requires practice. Jung developed specific, concrete techniques for consciously descending into hidden pain, methods that allow defensive strength to gradually dissolve without catastrophic collapse. These aren't self-care practices to make you feel better. They're alchemical tools designed to break you open safely, to create controlled cracks in your defensive structure, to give your imprisoned soul pathways to surface. Each practice serves a specific function in the sacred breakdown process. Practice 1. The daily check-in ritual function, rebuilding the connection between consciousness and actual internal state. Remember clue 110, I'm fine automaticity? You've trained yourself to not know what you're actually feeling. This practice begins reversing that dissociation. The practice, 3 times daily, morning, midday, before bed. Set a timer. When the timer sounds, stop everything and ask yourself 3 questions. What am I actually feeling right now? Name the emotion as specifically as possible, not just fine or stressed, but anxious, grief, rage, numb, overwhelmed. Where do I feel this in my body? Locate the physical sensation: tight chest, clenched jaw, heavy limbs, hollow stomach. What does this feeling need from me? Not what should I do about it, but what is it asking for? Write down your answers, even if the answer is I don't know or I feel nothing. The act of asking begins rebuilding internal awareness. Why this works. Jung understood that dissociation from feeling is maintained by never checking in. You move from task to task, maintaining momentum, avoiding stillness. This practice creates 3 daily pauses where your soul can finally speak. At first, you'll encounter only surface responses or numbness. That's expected. Your defensive structure has had years to build walls, but consistent practice gradually penetrates those walls. After weeks, you'll start noticing, oh, I'm actually terrified right now, not just a little stressed. Or, I've been numb for 3 days and didn't even realize it. Or, this feeling has been trying to get my attention all week. The critical rule: do not immediately fix, change, or improve what you discover. Just witness it, name it, locate it, acknowledge what it needs. The temptation is to identify a feeling and immediately develop a solution. That's your defensive structure reasserting control. This practice is about awareness without action, feeling without fixing, being with yourself without managing yourself. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." This practice teaches acceptance of your actual internal state, which is the foundation for all other transformation work. Practice 2, somatic tracking meditation function. Locating where pain is stored in the body and beginning physical release. Your body has been holding your hidden pain for years or decades. This practice helps you find it and start releasing it. The practice: set aside 15-20 minutes in a quiet, private space. Lie down or sit comfortably. Close your eyes and begin breathing deeply, inhaling for 4 counts, exhaling for 6 counts. Then, slowly scan your body from head to toe. Where am I holding tension? Where do I feel tightness, pain, numbness, or strange sensation? When you locate an area of held tension, don't try to release it immediately. Instead, breathe into it. Imagine your breath flowing directly to that spot. As you breathe, ask the tension, "What are you holding for me? What emotion is stored here?" Let images, words, or feelings arise without forcing them. You might suddenly feel sadness in your chest, rage in your jaw, terror in your stomach, grief in your shoulders. Let whatever surfaces just be there. Breathe with it. If tears come, let them flow. If your body wants to shake or move, allow it. Stay with the sensation for several minutes before moving to the next area. Why this works? Jung recognized that traumatic and suppressed emotions create chronic muscular tension, the body literally bracing against feeling. This practice helps you locate those holdings and begin the release process. Neuroscience confirms this. Emotions that aren't consciously processed get stored as somatic patterns. By consciously attending to body sensations and breathing into them, you're giving the body permission to release what it's been holding. The typical progression: week 1-2, you'll mostly notice physical tension but won't connect it to emotion yet. Week 3-4, emotions will start surfacing as you breathe into held areas, often surprising you with their intensity. Week 5+, you'll develop a map of where your body stores specific emotions, and you'll notice releases happening more readily. The warning: this can bring up intense emotions suddenly. If you feel overwhelmed, open your eyes, stand up, move around. Ground yourself in present reality. This is deep work. Go at a pace your system can handle. Jung emphasized, too much, too fast re-traumatizes rather than heals. Practice 3, shadow dialogue with the weak one. Function: reclaiming and integrating the vulnerable parts exiled to maintain strength. This is Jung's active imagination technique adapted specifically for the disowned, vulnerable self. The practice: set aside 30 minutes with journal and pen. Create a quiet, private space where you won't be interrupted. Close your eyes and invite the weak one, the part of you that's needy, helpless, frightened, vulnerable, to appear in your imagination. Don't force an image. Let it arise spontaneously. It might appear as a younger version of yourself, a child, an archetypal figure, beggar, wounded animal, prisoner, simply a presence or feeling. Once the image appears, begin dialogue through writing. You, who are you? The weak one. Write whatever response comes, even if it seems like you're making it up. You, what do you need from me? The weak one, let the response emerge. You, why have I kept you hidden? The weak one, listen to the answer. You, what happens if I continue rejecting you? The weak one, record the response. Continue the dialogue for 20-30 minutes, following wherever it leads. The weak one might express anger at being exiled. It might reveal the wounds that caused the split. It might beg to be acknowledged. It might explain how your strength has been its prison. Why this works? Jung discovered that exiled parts of the psyche have autonomous intelligence. They're not just imagination. They're actual psychic realities that consciousness has split off. By dialoguing with them, you're beginning the integration process. You're acknowledging that you are not just the strong one. You're also the weak one, the needy one, the frightened one. And wholeness requires embracing both. Common responses from the weak one. I'm the part of you that's still 5 years old, waiting for someone to say you're allowed to need things. I'm exhausted from being locked away. Your strength has been my prison cell for 30 years. I'm not weak, I'm human. You exiled your humanity to become invulnerable. If you keep rejecting me, I'll eventually destroy your life to force you to finally feel me. These aren't responses you consciously create. They emerge from the unconscious with their own wisdom. The practice evolution. Do this weekly initially. Over time, the weak one's messages will shift from anger and desperation to guidance and integration. Eventually, you'll feel the vulnerable part not as separate, but as an accepted aspect of your whole self. That's when integration is occurring. Practice 4, symbolic dream, amplification function, decoding the soul's messages delivered through recurring dream symbols. Your soul has been trying to communicate through dreams, drowning, being chased, unable to speak. This practice helps you understand what it's saying. The practice. Keep a dream journal by your bed. Immediately upon waking, record any dream fragments, even if they don't make sense. Focus especially on recurring dreams or nightmares. Once you've recorded the dream, use Jung's amplification technique. Identify the core symbol. What's the central image or action? Drowning, being chased, collapsing building, losing teeth, etc. Free associate. What does this symbol mean to you personally? What feelings does it evoke? What memories arise? Find the archetypal meaning. What does this symbol mean universally? Jung would consult mythology, fairy tales, religious symbolism. You can research the archetypal meaning online or in dream dictionaries based on Jungian psychology. Connect to current life. Where in your waking life are you experiencing what this symbol represents? Ask what it's trying to tell you. If this dream is your soul's message, what is it saying about the pain you're hiding? Example, dream, repeatedly drowning, struggling to breathe underwater. Personal association, feeling overwhelmed, suffocating under responsibilities. Archetypal meaning, water represents emotion, unconscious. Drowning, or being overwhelmed by unconscious material trying to surface. Current life connection, taking on more and more responsibilities, never saying no, feeling like you can't keep your head above water. Soul's message, you're drowning in unfelt emotion. Your strength is keeping you submerged. You need to stop fighting the water, emotion, and finally let yourself feel it. Why this works? Dreams bypass conscious defenses. Your soul can say things symbolically in dreams that would be too threatening to consciousness if stated directly. By learning to decode the symbols, you're learning your soul's language, and you're receiving guidance about what needs to be felt, released, or integrated. The practice evolution. Initially, dreams may intensify as you start paying attention. Your psyche realizes consciousness is finally listening. As you work with the messages and actually feel what they're pointing to, the dreams often shift, becoming less desperate, more guiding. Eventually, you may experience what Jung called big dreams, profound symbolic dreams that mark major psychological transformation. Practice 5. The I'm not fine. Practice function, breaking the automatic defense of pretending you're okay. This practice directly counters clue number 10, the I'm fine automaticity. The practice, once daily with one chosen person, tell the truth about your internal state. The formula, actually, I'm not fine, I'm real feeling. Examples, actually, I'm not fine, I'm exhausted and I don't know how to stop. Actually, I'm not fine, I'm scared about things I can't even name. Actually, I'm not fine, I'm angry and I don't understand why. Actually, I'm not fine, I feel completely numb and empty. The key, don't minimize, qualify, or immediately fix it. Don't follow it with, but I'm handling it, or, but I'll be okay. Just state the truth and let it land. Let the other person witness it without you managing their response. Why this works. Every time you say, I'm fine when you're not, you reinforce dissociation. Every time you tell the truth, you strengthen the connection between consciousness and actual internal state. This practice also begins addressing relational isolation. You're teaching someone how to be present with your vulnerability. The typical resistance. Your first attempts will feel terrifying. Your defensive structure will scream, don't burden them. They don't want to hear this. You're being weak. That's the persona fighting to maintain control. Push through. Choose one person you trust enough to practice with initially. Over time, expand to others. The transformation. After weeks of this practice, you'll notice you're becoming more aware of your actual internal state throughout the day. The compulsive I'm fine response is weakening. You're developing at least one genuine relationship where you can be authentically vulnerable. Most surprisingly, people often respond with relief. Thank you for being real. I never felt like I could share my struggles with you because you always seemed so together. Your vulnerability gives others permission for theirs. Practice 6. Scheduled breakdown time. Function. Creating a safe container for controlled emotional release. This is the practice Jung would have called sacred space for dissolution. The practice. Schedule 30 to 60 minutes weekly where your only job is to feel whatever you've been suppressing. Practical setup. Private space where you won't be interrupted. No phone, no distractions. Tissues, water, comfortable place to sit or lie down. Optional. Music that evokes emotion. Set a timer so you know when the session ends. Then give yourself complete permission to cry without stopping yourself, to rage, hit pillows, scream into cushions, to feel helpless, desperate, or overwhelmed, to express need, even if no one's there to meet it. Let yourself feel the need fully. This isn't wallowing. It's conscious, contained release of accumulated pain. Why this works. One reason people maintain defensive strength is fear that if they start feeling, they'll never stop. The emotions will consume them. This practice proves that's not true. By creating a bounded container, 30 to 60 minutes, you learn you can feel intensely and then return to functioning. Emotions have natural cycles. They peak and then subside. Controlled release prevents catastrophic flood. Jung emphasized, emotions need expression, not suppression or endless analysis. This practice provides the space for that expression. The typical progression, first few sessions, you might feel silly or unable to access emotion. That's your defensive structure resisting. Keep showing up. Sessions 4-8. Emotions will start flowing more readily. You might be surprised by their intensity. Sessions 10+. You'll develop capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. The backlog begins clearing. The critical rule, When the timer ends, you stop and transition back to regular functioning. Wash your face, drink water, do something grounding, walk, stretch, prepare food. This teaches your psyche. There's time for feeling and time for functioning. Both are valid. You're not trapped in either state. Practice 7. The Strength Inventory. Function: distinguishing defensive compensation from authentic capacity. Not all your strength is false, but some of it is defensive, and you need to identify which is which. The practice: create 2 lists. List 1. Ways I demonstrate strength. Examples: never ask for help, always stay calm, handle everything myself, am always there for others, never cry, push through pain, maintain control, achieve despite obstacles, etc. List 2. For each item, ask, is this authentic capacity or defensive compensation? Authentic capacity: strength you can access flexibly, that doesn't exhaust you, that you could choose not to use without anxiety. Defensive compensation: strength you must maintain, that exhausts you, that you can't drop without terror. Example analysis: I never ask for help. Defensive: I'm terrified of depending on others because it felt dangerous in childhood. I'm good in crisis. Mixed: I genuinely handle stress well. Authentic: but I also seek out crisis to avoid feeling in calm moments. Defensive: I'm always there for friends. Defensive: I can't say no because my value depends on being needed. I work hard. Authentic: I enjoy meaningful work and choose to engage fully. Why this works: you're not trying to eliminate all strength. You're trying to identify which strength is actually defense against vulnerability. Once identified, you can begin the process of honoring the defensive strength. It served you. Gradually releasing it, it's no longer needed. Strengthening the authentic capacity. This is real. Jung called this differentiating the persona from the self, figuring out what's mask and what's essence. The transformation: as you release defensive compensation and maintain only authentic capacity, something paradoxical happens. You become stronger, because defensive strength requires constant energy to maintain. Authentic capacity flows naturally without depleting you. People often report, I thought letting go of my defenses would make me weak. Instead, I have more energy and capability than ever, because I'm not exhausting myself maintaining a facade. Practice 8. Active imagination for release. Function: dialoguing directly with symptoms as messengers from the soul. This is Jung's signature technique, adapted specifically for the spiritual clues from Section 5. The practice: choose one symptom, a clue that's been persistent. Chronic physical pain, rage attacks, exhaustion, the helper compulsion, mysterious illness. Treat the symptom as if it's an autonomous being with intelligence and purpose. In imagination, give it form. If it's physical pain, imagine it as a figure, creature, or presence. If it's an emotion, rage, exhaustion, let it appear as a character. Ask permission. May I speak with you? Then dialogue. You. Who are you? What are you? Symptom. Let the response come. It might be surprising. You. Why are you here? What are you trying to tell me? Symptom. Listen without judging. You. What do you need from me? Symptom. Record the answer. You. What happens if I continue ignoring you? Symptom. Let it show you. You. How can we work together instead of against each other? Symptom. Receive guidance. Why this works: Jung discovered that symptoms aren't random. They're purposeful communications from the unconscious. By treating them as messengers rather than enemies, you access their wisdom. Common revelations: chronic pain. I'm the only way to make you stop and feel. I'm not attacking you. I'm protecting you from complete collapse. Rage. I'm 30 years of suppressed boundaries. Every time you said it's fine when it wasn't, I grew stronger. Feel me or I'll eventually consume you. Exhaustion. I'm forcing you to rest because you won't choose it. Your body is staging an intervention. These aren't metaphors. They're actual psychic dynamics made conscious through dialogue. The transformation. Once you understand what the symptom is communicating and begin addressing the actual need, feeling the pain, setting boundaries, resting, the symptom often shifts or resolves, not because you cured it, but because it accomplished its purpose, forcing consciousness to acknowledge what defensive strength had been hiding. Integrating the practices. These 8 practices work together as a comprehensive system. Daily check-in builds awareness. Somatic tracking locates pain in the body. Shadow. Dialogue integrates exiled parts. Dream amplification decodes soul messages. I'm not fine breaks defensive patterns. Scheduled breakdown provides release container. Strength inventory distinguishes defense from capacity. Active imagination transforms symptoms into wisdom. Jung's recommendation: don't try to do all 8 simultaneously. Start with 2 to 3 that resonate most strongly. Practice consistently for 4 to 6 weeks, then add others as you develop capacity. The goal isn't perfection. It's consistent engagement with the process of conscious vulnerability, gradually creating cracks in your defensive structure so your imprisoned soul can finally surface, be felt, and integrate. Jung's promise: if you do these practices consistently, breakthrough is inevitable. Not because the practices are magic, but because they systematically undermine the defenses that have been keeping your pain hidden. And once those defenses begin dissolving consciously, the transformation your soul has been orchestrating can finally occur, not catastrophically, consciously, safely, transformatively. The journey from hidden pain to integrated wholeness isn't random. It follows an archetypal pattern Jung observed across hundreds of cases, including his own. Understanding these stages helps you recognize where you are, what's happening, and what comes next. It transforms what feels like meaningless suffering into a heroic journey with purpose, direction, and inevitable resolution. These are the 6 stages of sacred vulnerability. Stage 1. Recognition of the clues. Duration: 1 to 6 months. Psychological process: awakening from unconscious defense. This stage begins when you finally stop dismissing the spiritual clues your soul has been sending, the synchronicities of breakdown you've been ignoring. Suddenly, you can't ignore them anymore. The dreams that have been waking you finally admit they mean something. The mysterious physical symptoms, you stop accepting medical dismissals and recognize them as psychosomatic messages. The rage, the exhaustion, the helper's compulsion, the "I'm fine" automaticity. For the first time, you see them not as separate issues, but as a coherent pattern. A pattern that says, you're hiding unbearable pain behind unsustainable strength. What's happening internally? Consciousness is beginning to penetrate the defensive structure. You're having moments of painful clarity. Oh God, I'm not actually fine. I haven't been fine for years, maybe decades. This awareness comes in waves, moments of recognition followed by defensive dismissal. Your ego fights it. This doesn't apply to me. I'm handling things. Other people have it worse. I just need to try harder. But the recognition keeps returning, stronger each time. Common experiences, feeling like you're waking up from a long sleep. Sudden awareness of how exhausted you actually are. Realizing you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely happy, not just okay. Noticing patterns you've been blind to, always helping others, never receiving, always being strong, never being weak. Feeling both relieved, I'm not crazy, something is actually wrong, and terrified, if I acknowledge this, everything will change. The challenge, the temptation to minimize and return to defensive strength. Your entire identity is built on being fine, being strong, being capable. Admitting you're not threatens that identity fundamentally. Signs you're progressing. You stop dismissing the clues and start actually investigating them. You might seek therapy, read books like this, begin journaling. You have conversations where you admit, tentatively, that you might not be as together as you appear. You feel increasing discomfort with maintaining your usual strength persona. It's starting to feel like a lie. Jung's guidance for this stage: don't judge yourself for not seeing this sooner. The psyche reveals material only when consciousness can begin to handle it. You're seeing it now because you're finally ready to see it. What your soul is doing: creating the conditions for consciousness to accept what it's been defending against. The clues intensify until denial becomes more painful than acknowledgement. Stage 2, terror of letting go. Duration, 3–6 months. Psychological process, confronting the core, fear. You've recognized the pattern. Now comes the terrifying part, realizing what addressing it actually requires. This stage is dominated by one overwhelming fear. If I stop being strong, if I actually let myself be vulnerable, need help, acknowledge pain, I'll completely fall apart and never be able to put myself back together. What's happening internally? Your defensive structure is fighting for survival. It's been protecting you since childhood. It believes letting go means death. Not metaphorical death, actual psychological annihilation. So it generates intense fear to prevent you from proceeding. You'll lose everything: your job, your relationships, your identity. People will see you as weak and abandon you. You'll become the needy, pathetic person you've spent your life avoiding becoming. There's an abyss beneath your strength, and if you step off, you'll fall forever. Common experiences: increased anxiety and hypervigilance. Oscillation between "I need to do this work" and "I'm fine, this is unnecessary." Bargaining: maybe I can just be a little more vulnerable without actually falling apart. Grief: mourning the identity you're going to have to release. Physical symptoms often worsen. Your body knows change is coming and resists. The challenge: this is the stage where most people turn back. The terror is too intense. They return to defensive strength, convinced it's safer than the unknown of vulnerability. Jung observed that many patients spent months or even years in this stage, circling the necessary work but unable to commit to it. What distinguishes those who proceed? Usually, something makes staying the same more painful than changing. Health crisis that forces the issue. The relationship ended because intimacy was impossible. Existential despair that becomes unbearable. Or simply, the exhaustion of maintaining the defense finally exceeds the fear of releasing it.